Even though it was already deep night outside, the windows of Sophie's hotel were still brightly lit. On a small table stood carefully perfume, a notebook, and a pack of cigarettes, under which was a note with the room number 300. Yu San-shui carefully combed his hair in front of the mirror, admiring himself, because 40-year-old men were simply like wine, becoming more beautiful with each passing year. Having poured half a bottle of perfume on himself, the man shouted loudly that he was leaving food on the table. Yu Shen sat on the sofa behind the man, holding a red book called the Moj Law. As he left the room, the man briefly added that his son should not stay up late as he had exams tomorrow. Without looking up from the book, the boy purred and continued reading, making it clear with his whole appearance that he was indifferent to his father's words. Finally, San-shui said that he was going on a date, after which he wished the young man to pass all his exams well. As soon as the door to the room closed, the guy immediately slammed the book, abruptly finishing reading. The guy jumped up, picked up his cell phone, and quickly dialed the police number. After several short beeps, the next section picked up the phone and asked the reason for the call. The guy said that at 8 o'clock in the evening at the Sophie Hotel there would be a crime in room 302, after which he confirmed that he was absolutely sure of his own words. At the end, the girl asked how the guy was connected to the criminal, to which he called the criminal his father. He sat down at a table on which stood a textbook on law and a plate of cold broccoli and added seriously that he served the people. The young man slowly put the cold food into his mouth and thought about tomorrow's awakening ceremony. A strange scroll kept appearing in his head, making Yu Sheng wonder if anything would change after he woke up. Half an hour later, he finished his evening meal, washed the dishes, and began his usual activities. He was sitting on the same sofa again and carefully reading something in the Moj legislation. Suddenly, a loud ringtone came from his phone and a ringtone screensaver appeared on the screen. Yu Shen picked up his mobile phone and looked at the unknown number in surprise, wondering if it could have been a coincidence. But despite this, he picked up the phone and said hello in an indifferent voice. A bunch of swear words, images, and many other catchphrases came out of the receiver, after which Yu San-shui asked the guy to post bail for him. To reduce the pressure of this garbage on his ears, the boy moved his hand with the phone to the side, and from there his father's instructions on how to find money began to be heard. Somewhere among the thickets, the guy dug up a jar of money, which contained about $2,000, which should have been enough for bail. Without thinking twice, the guy put the wad of bills in his pocket and went back to the hotel. On the way, he dialed the number of the station where his father was holding him and said that he refused to post bail. The young man argued that breaking the law should be punished, and therefore prison should re-educate the man and make him a worthwhile member of society. Yu Sheng added that the law-abiding policy had always been a positive force that Moge had spread, and that was why people had to protect these principles. The guy ran quickly, holding the hand of the girl running behind him and shouting that they had to run away. Suddenly, a bunch of sharp arrows flew towards the guy, which he barely had time to see. One of them flew so close to him that it almost touched his eye. The guy dodged the arrows with lightning speed, quickly dragging the young lady in his wake so that she too would remain unharmed. A crowd of angry men with various sticks, swords, and other weapons relentlessly chased the friends, shouting threats in a savage manner. Suddenly, a huge wall with barbed wire on top of it appeared in front of Yu Shen and the draft. They stood dumbfounded and looked at the problem that had arisen before them in confusion, realizing that they had reached a dead end. A few meters behind them, a gang of thugs stopped, obviously angry at their friends. The leader of the pack, a young man with a mohawk and a bunch of piercings, smiled sarcastically and said that he absolutely did not believe that his friends were trying to leave their city of Zui. Without thinking twice, he pointed his bat at them and ordered his friends to stab the poor fellows, after which the other two attacked them with knives. Yu Shen and her friend quickly took out their own daggers and glared menacingly at the attackers. Within a minute, the pagans were flying around them like bird feathers, screaming in pain and begging for mercy. But this didn't stop his friends at all. Yu Shen ran like crazy from one guy to another, cutting their throats. A few minutes later, all the thieves were lying on the cold ground in pools of blood, and the young lady, looking at the guy for the last time, said that he could go. The young man looked closely at the card, which instantly began to change its color and on which the inscription "Pass" appeared. Yu Shen found himself in some strange warehouse, where a huge wall opened up in front of him, from which a beam of light fell on him. The bright sunlight signaling the beginning of a new day made the guy open his eyes and get out of bed. The boy sat up on his bed and looked out the window with an empty gaze, without changing his usual expression. His school was one of the largest and most modern in the city, which made it quite popular among young people. The boy walked down the street and listened to his classmates talking around him about how excited they were that night, because today was the day of awakening. There were a lot of people around the guy, all busy talking about today, but despite this, Yusheng felt lonely. In the preparatory class, Liu Qingfeng, who was the boy's class teacher, menacingly put his hands on the table and reminded the students that the awakening execution would begin in an hour. He would loudly tell everyone what was in store for them and give instructions that would motivate the children to awaken correctly and reveal their talent. While the students, in turn, listened to him attentively, Liu clenched his fist tightly and ordered everyone to do their utmost to make others respect them. He quickly placed the same fist on his forearm and asked the students what all their efforts were for if they would still end up behind. A moment later, everyone in the class also clenched their fists and raised them above their heads, shouting the oath of service to the people. Only Shen sat indifferently and stared out the window, quietly muttering to himself that it was the people who were being served. Liu Qingfeng had a slight dislike for the guy, as after barely hearing the words, he looked at the guy with a slightly bad look. But a moment later, he looked at his watch and loudly told everyone that it was time to go to the awakening point. The group of students, in which Yu Shun was the last one, rushed to the exit, but only he was closely watched by the teacher, who was thinking in his head about how many patterns would awaken in him. In the middle of the school football field, 3 lines of children were lined up, with metal detectors in front of them, and then small tables with magic balls on them. One of the students just happened to touch a magic object, which showed him the number 4, which meant exactly 4 patterns, which made the guy incredibly happy. The inspector standing nearby and writing something down added that such a pattern was a good talent, and if the guy had hatched a power system, he could have joined the police department. Since the resurrection of Qi, during human awakening, patterns appeared on the magic ball that predicted the awakened one's talent, and the one who rolled the maximum number 9 became the greatest of the living. The teacher called Yu Sheng to the metal detector and asked him if he had any metal objects, to which he calmly replied that he always carried a couple of blades for self-defense. Liu Qingfeng ordered the young man to take them out because the awakening equipment was very expensive and the metal could affect the test results. The guy agreed without complaint and began to take out of his pocket daggers, knives, and blades, which he really always carried with him. He threw a pile of cold weapons, which even included 4-cornered stars and sharp ends of arrows, onto the table in front of him, after which the teacher asked if that was all. He calmly replied that that was all, and his classmates behind his back began to actively whisper, surprised by such a huge amount of weapons. The young man passed through the metal detector, which immediately beeped, causing Liu Qingfeng to ask again if he had gotten everything. The guy, looking thoughtful, sarcastically said that it could have been his iron will. The mentor was not going to tolerate such impudence, so he immediately yelled at the guy so that he would get absolutely everything. Yu Shen took off his jacket and shook it over the table, onto which fell a few more stars, a couple of knives, and 2 arrowheads. The metal detector let the young man through and he carefully approached the magic ball, which immediately became numb from his presence. The bullet shimmered with a blue glow, and behind Yu Shen's back, a huge red egg began to appear, with patterns gradually emerging on it. After counting the number of patterns, everyone present stood up with their mouths open, because the screen above the guy showed the number 9. The examiner stared at the boy and couldn't believe his eyes, while he just pointed indifferently at the ball, adding that it was broken. The man also looked at the ball in amazement and declared that it was not broken. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the young man swung his fist and smashed the magic ball that was in front of him, and it just crumbled, and his friends flew away. The boy rubbed his smoldering fist and returned to the inspector, repeating that the bullet had broken, which he couldn't help but agree with. Instantly, Liu Qingfeng grabbed his hand with a strong grip, not allowing the guy to go anywhere. He came closer to the young man and ordered the boy to go with him since this was damage to public property. The teacher waved his hand upward and a blue flame appeared above them, quickly beginning to form a strange bird. In just a moment, something very similar to a blue phoenix appeared above their heads. So Yu Sheng had no choice but to climb onto it together with his mentor. As he climbed onto the bird, the boy looked down in a little surprise, internally wondering what had happened, although his expression still remained unchanged. The inspector, along with the students and a couple of teachers, remained on the school field to watch the huge bird, which Liu carried away along with the boy in an unknown direction. Suddenly, the familiar scroll appeared before the guy's eyes again, reacting to the guy's awakening, causing him to deflate. Yu Shen and his mentor stood in front of the director's desk, where the director himself sat and carefully read the boy's personal file. Instantly, a middle-aged man with small glasses on his nose and a bald spot on his head suspiciously asked the guy if he was really from the crime city. Liu Qingfeng also looked at his disciple with suspicion and surprise, once again saying the name of the strange city out loud. Even the secretary standing behind the director was secretly surprised by the guy's place of origin. The boy was in the clouds and did not answer the principal's questions, so the teacher gently took him by the shoulder and reminded him that he was still in the real world. The man looked at the student and thought hard about the fact that even though he had gotten an egg with 9 patterns, the guy was from a criminal city. He clasped his hands together in concentration and asked the boy what he would do if he woke up 6 or even 9 times. Yushin, without even thinking, confidently replied that he would serve the people faithfully. This answer stunned the director a little, since he really had high intentions as a man from a criminal city. The husband asked the young man what he had dreamed of doing before, to which the guy replied that yesterday he reported his own father when he committed a crime in a hotel. Understanding the guy's hint, the director ordered him to rest and not tell anyone about the results of awakening when he would think about what to do with the guy's studies. The guy immediately thanked the director, said goodbye to him, and headed for the door. While the director could not understand how this guy managed to get out of the criminal city, it was deep night outside and Yu Sheng was just approaching his own house when suddenly something alerted him. There were bloodstains on the door handle of the front door, and the guy immediately realized that someone had broken in. A stranger with scarlet hair and the same bloodstains all over his body was tirelessly rummaging through the closet. Instantly, he heard some strange sounds coming from the corridor and became alert. Without hesitating for long, the guy realized that someone had entered the house and, taking a knife in his hands, carefully stood around the corner. But Yu Shen was much more agile, so within a few seconds, a sharp knife was at the stranger's neck. The guy looked at Yu Sheng with confused eyes, and Yu Sheng only said that the guy shouldn't have moved because his knife was right next to his aorta. Seeing a bunch of bloodstains on the floor, Shen said with displeasure that he didn't like cleaning at all, and the guy guiltily began to say that he only needed medicine. The irritated boy pressed the knife blade a little harder and added that the healing potion was ahead on the second shelf. He asked the stranger ironically why he decided not to take the medicine, to which the guy only replied that the medicine was not that necessary. The red-haired man understood that he needed to get out of there as quickly as possible in order to stay alive. But noticing the blade of the knife, which was pressing on his neck more and more, he asked if the young man really wanted to kill him. Yu Sheng coldly said that killing outside the crime city was forbidden. The stranger breathed a sigh of relief and said that he was now indebted to the guy, after which he asked if he needed his help. Without changing his indifferent expression, Yu Sheng said that by repaying the debt, the boy could kill himself. The poor guy had beads of sweat on his face and he thought that the owner had really gone crazy because he didn't need his life. The guy told Yu Shen that he was a murderer and could kill someone for free instead of committing suicide. But looking at him with a cold gaze, Shen continued to stand his ground and repeated to him to kill himself. Beads of sweat were running down the young man's face, and 100 plans for escape or liberation were running through his head. He screamed, asking why the boy wanted him dead, and he coldly replied that it was retribution for breaking into the room and for the bloodstains on the floor. The poor fellow, at a loss, exclaimed that in the criminal city there was an annual quota for the justification of one person, and since the owner was very young, this was simply impossible. Yu Shen pressed the knife to his neck again and sternly confirmed that his tongue was too long. The poor guy couldn't find any better way out than to agree with the guy and tell him that he had finally killed him. At that moment, closing his eyes, he had already managed to say goodbye to the world and promise himself that in his next life he would definitely become an exemplary killer. But nothing happened and the guy opened one eye in surprise, not understanding why he was still alive. He asked why you haven't started yet, to which the guy rudely repeated the ban on murders outside the crime city. He screamed at Shen to let him go if he wasn't going to kill him, but the boy refused. Finally, the red-haired man noticed that the owner kept mentioning laws and regulations, so he decided to change his tactics a little. He said with resentment that holding someone against their will is also considered a crime and is punishable by 3 years imprisonment under the criminal code. Yu Shun ignored this and asked the boy how old he was, to which he replied 17. The young man thought to himself that the boy was still very young, since he had not even had time to wake up. After standing and thinking for a while, he finally decided to remove the knife from the unfortunate man's neck. The guy put the dagger in a case and hid it behind his belt at the back of his back, so that it became completely invisible. Yu Xin said that the red-haired man could walk, which made him seriously surprised, not believing his words. He repeated his words again, turned around and walked in the opposite direction, waving his hand. The guy decided not to hesitate for long and rushed headlong to the exit, glad that the eccentric sighed. The guy ran to the door shouting that he was finally free, not holding back the joy in his soul. But suddenly someone's strong hand grabbed his shoulder, forcing him to stop. As soon as the boy walked out the door of the house, Yu Sheng grabbed him by the shirt, preventing him from running away. The guy dragged him back into the room, despite the guy's unsuccessful attempts to hide. A minute later, he was lying on the floor again, looking at Yu Sheng with a confused look and asking what he was doing. As coldly as ever, the young man said that since the boy had left the room, he had not restricted his freedom at all, so it could not be considered a violation of the law. The guy seriously folded his arms across his chest and stood before the poor man, who did not understand why fate was punishing him like this. Leaving the stranger sitting in the middle of the blood-soaked floor, Yu Sheng went to get medicine for the boy, as he was badly injured. On the way, he threw the young man some soap and a brush, ordering the red-haired man to wipe all the blood off the floor, or he would not be able to say hello. The guy walked up to a huge cabinet, opened the top drawer, and began looking for the one he needed among a pile of jars. Suddenly, he heard strange sounds behind him and turned around in surprise to see what was happening. Yu Sheng saw a guy on the floor who was really tirelessly trying to scrub the red stains off the parquet. The guy came up to him and handed him a bottle of medicine that was supposed to help the young man. The kid took the jar in his hands and hesitantly thanked him, because he did not expect such kindness from the owner. But just as he was about to put the pill in his mouth, Yu Sheng said that it was all about the medicine's expiration date, which, unfortunately, had already expired. But he had something else in mind, because he really had no intention of poisoning the stranger. The boy was indignant, squeezing the jar in his hand, while Shen thought about the energy that was born from the emotions he was about to evoke. He looked at the red-haired man and suddenly the familiar scroll appeared before his eyes again. Yu Sheng immediately said that he was joking and the medicine was good, so the guy definitely had to drink it, since he would die in 32 minutes due to blood loss. Within a few minutes, there was a half-empty jar of pills on the floor, and next to it a roll of bandage. The kid bandaged and treated his own wounds while the owner sat opposite him and asked if he really was a killer, because the guy didn't look like him. The guy started saying that he only missed once, so he needed time to become a good killer. However, after a moment he waved it off and refused to speak further, while the guy said that those who become killers are those who give themselves to this cause completely and entirely. The young man cried out that he was not afraid of death at all and wanted to die nobly, like a real killer. And Shen, in turn, asked why he did not kill him, but left so calmly. The red-haired man said that according to the weight of his professional principles, he only works for money, since murder was his job, and he didn't touch the usual innocent people. Yu Sheng replied in a calm voice that the guy simply couldn't kill. He stood up with a hint of disappointment and added that he had already accidentally begun to believe that the baby was a killer. The young man began to tell that in order to order the murder, he had to lie about his age, since he had not yet had time to wake up. But he didn't think at all that there was such a difference between the awakened and the unawakened, especially even when he had awakened only the spoon. Yu Sheng returned to the exit and indifferently ordered the guy to heal and wash the floor, and before he went to throw out the trash at the door, the stranger remained sitting on the floor in surprise, not understanding whether he had really decided to let him go. As he reached for the door handle, the boy said over his shoulder that the kid needed to follow all the orders before leaving or he would pay for it. The guy stood there, just as surprised, looking after him, when Shen decided to add something. As he walked out the door, he noted that the unawakened weren't as strong as he thought. Approximately 100 years ago, powerful Edi forces began to be reborn again, appearing in the world. After this, evil spirits began to reign again and destroy everything in their path. Dark forces were raging and threatening the entire human civilization, destroying all living things. But fortunately, the first awakened ones appeared, and sacrificing their own strength and lives, they created 4 great pledges. These were the Pledge of Peace for the Unclean, the Pledge of the East, the Pledge of the Dome, and the Pledge of Demons who stopped evil. And the human masters stood guard over them, not letting it pass further. Yu Sheng was walking down the city street when he suddenly heard a conversation between 3 guys walking in front of him, and one of them loudly cried out that the Pledge of the Unclean One's peace had not stood. The other 2 stared blankly at his phone, not understanding how this had happened, when he, in turn, read out that a monster had appeared in Xinhai, causing many people to suffer. On the phone, the guys saw a picture of a huge, enraged bull, whose eyes were blazing with purple fire, and the people around him were screaming terribly. All three muttered discontentedly, showering complaints about the Ministry of Expulsion of the Unclean and their unsuccessful work. Yu Shen continued walking, but the strangers behind him were still talking about how the human world was becoming restless again. The guy walked along the empty alleys between the old buildings, thinking about the conversation he had just witnessed. Finally, the guy arrived at his destination, stepping over the threshold and entering an ordinary stall. Behind the counter sat a huge man with a huge beard and a scar over his tiredly yawning left eye. But suddenly, he opened his eyes and saw Yu Shen standing in front of him, silently waiting. The man threw a small paper bag on the table and added that he had the goods. The guy took the package, and the man in turn added that this was the last time. He leaned his elbows on the table and moved closer to the guy, looking him in the eyes and saying that now they were tickets. The young man waved his hand, turned around and headed towards the exit, indifferently saying goodbye to her husband. Health rose from his chair and anger flashed in his eyes, and a malicious smile appeared on his face that did not promise anything good. Sensing this, Yu Sheng coldly added that there wouldn't be a next time, after which the man immediately flew to the ground with a crash, and a pool of blood quickly began to appear under his head. Coming home and sitting on the sofa, the guy opened the package and took out a small red stone. He carefully examined the stone called the demonic crystal, which was the quintessence that the evil spirits created after absorbing human life force. Suddenly, the guy jumped up and took his own crossbow, as in his opinion, several appeared. Within 10 minutes, a full-fledged defense system was set up in the room, which consisted of several crossbows and a bunch of red threads, as a result of which the first person to enter the room would suffer. The young man gathered the ends of all the red threads in his hands, took the red stone in his other hand and assessed his work. He sat down carefully on the floor, collecting his thoughts and preparing for the next step. Yu Shen closed his eyes, and the stones in his hands hung in the air, igniting with red flames, as did the strange circle that appeared behind him. On the slopes of a large mountain outside the city, a high concrete fence with barbed wire was visible, protecting the pledge of obedience to the unclean. A small group of 3 oddballs, dressed in long red cloaks, was climbing up the road that led through the foot of the mountain. Suddenly, a strange old man appeared in the air above them, threateningly saying that the road was closed. Being, one of the weirdos smiled kindly and said that they just had to pass. The old man had already opened his eyes in irritation and looked down at those who had dared to disturb his peace, after which he angrily repeated once again about the closed road. Then the man, who had been smiling softly until then, changed his manner of speaking to a more unfriendly one and said irritably that he had insisted. In the blink of an eye, strange magical powers began to swirl around the old man. The sky became cloudy and lightning appeared here and there, after which he angrily exclaimed that death awaited them. A huge black whirlpool suddenly appeared above the weirdos, which looked like a black hole, which gradually began to suck them in. The Redzvets screamed in fear, not hiding the horror in their eyes from what they saw. Their leader fell to his knees, apologizing to the old man, justifying his actions as a joke and speaking of his devotion to the human people. Instantly, an angry cry from the old man was heard from above, who had no intention of letting the red-flowered people through. Trying to rectify the situation, one of the eccentrics asked the old man with a smile if he had any other questions for them. Having calmed down, the man sternly ordered the eccentrics to order their divine throne to change their name, since it is not at all natural for such unclean creatures to be called by a bright name. The leader of the group bowed to the old man and, smiling sheepishly, added that he would pass on the advice to the government. After this, the group of weirdos finally turned around and headed down the mountain. The old man looked at them with a disappointed, irritated look, after which he again withdrew into himself. Magical forces swirled around him again, and his staff rose into the air. The last of the 3 demonic crystals was still hanging in the air in front of Yu Sheng, while its magical sense was interrupted by the phone ringing. The boy's sudden surprise caused the last of the stones to fall to the floor with a clang, interrupting the session. The young man picked up the phone and heard Liu Qingfeng's voice on the other end, telling him that the school would be holding an assessment for gifted students tomorrow morning, which he needed to attend. He continued to tell that the certification was incredibly important because only one student would pass it, and the guy in turn obediently exclaimed. Suddenly, the teacher asked the boy about his father, who did not answer, and a picture of his father appeared in the boy's head, which made him think a little. But almost immediately, Yu Sheng replied that most likely the prison prohibited the use of telephones, and then hung up. Liu Qingfeng remained standing there with his mouth open, holding the phone in his hand. Only a few minutes later, He remembered that the boy had turned his father over to the police for the crime he had committed at the hotel. Yusheng stood in the middle of the room, staring at the calendar hanging on the wall in front of him. He looked at the number 1 and thought that there were only 312 days left. The next day, everyone at school was buzzing about the assessment, as they were worried about whether it would be successful. Instantly, the teacher entered the classroom and everyone suddenly became quiet, stopping talking. The mentor leaned his elbows on the table and said that he had just received a message about a change in the situation. He said that this time not only the unclean ones from the Ministry of Expulsion came to the school, but also officers from the reserve of the Ministry of Security, which is why only 5 people could participate in the certification. At that moment, all the students suddenly had the thought in their heads that they would be chosen, and only Yusheng acted as if he didn't care. The mentor raised his hand and began to speak slowly, saying that it was the director who had chosen the students who would go to the assessment, preparing to point them out. After a short pause, Liu Qingfeng loudly announced that Yusheng had been chosen. At that very moment, a bunch of disgruntled shouts flew from the class, since the classmates considered the guy a weakling and were outraged that he was the one chosen by the principal. The teacher scolded the students for such a violent reaction and added that there is no justice in the world and anyone who has suffered it should perceive it as a sign of self-improvement. The children sat quietly at their desks, heads bowed, listening to the lecture and not trying to object to the teacher. After finishing his speech, Liu Qingfeng ordered Yusheng to go to the principal's office because he wanted to talk to him. A few minutes later, the guy was standing in the director's office, where he, as always, was sitting at the table and behind him stood the secretary. Seeing him, the director smiled and was pleased with his cheerfulness, after which he asked how the boy's father was doing. The young man replied indifferently that the machinations in the criminal city were very expensive. The director did not expect such a short answer at all, so he was a little confused, not knowing what to say. He cleared his throat and decided to get to the main point, saying that the certification showed not only the students, but also the school itself, which was very important, because Mobe was not a big city. The husband said that this certification would determine who would be the new principal at the school, so he ordered the boy not to give in, no matter what it cost him. Without batting an eyelid, the guy coldly asked the director about the price of the question. The director was seriously surprised by such a bold statement, since he did not expect such a provocative question. Yusheng explained that according to the rules of the criminal city, a person must be paid when asked for something, and so he refused to provide the service for free. The director, somewhat depressed, said that as a reward the boy would get to sit for the exam, which was beneficial for both of them. The guy said that in his understanding the exam was a ticket that someone had to finance. He called it a so-called fee and added that in a criminal city, those who did not follow the rules did not live long. Having given up his position, the director assured the guy that he would give him 3 first-level crystals. With the same unchanging emotions on his face, the young man agreed, calling it an agreement. Turning towards the door, he decided to ask who he would need to kill, which surprised the director and his secretary. The man began to assure him that there was no need to kill anyone, which made the guy a little happy since killing was prohibited outside the criminal city. The director was simply stunned by the student's mood, and he thought that he was missing 3 soul stones. Finally, he reminded the boy that he shouldn't worry about the other students, and that he also needed to rest on the school bus, to which the boy simply agreed. Yusheng chose a nice spot by the window and sat there peacefully when suddenly a guy approached him. He looked at him suspiciously, while he introduced himself as Zhao Zicheng and added that he was with 9B. Behind him stood 2 people, a girl and a boy, whom he introduced as Li Kai and Yang Ruoxin, and then asked Yusheng's name. The guy introduced himself to him coldly and continued to look out the window, ignoring them. Zhao decided to sit down next to his new friend and began to tell him that he had learned about the city mayor's presence at the certification. He began to talk about how Premier's son was also older than Moj and believed that the best talents came from there. The guy smiled and added that if the young man had entered Moj, he would have immediately become popular, so this was a unique opportunity to become successful. Z suddenly thought about how there were many masters in other schools, but they only chose one, so it was incredibly difficult to win. His friends joined the conversation and said that Chief Zhao was bound to win because his father was the head of the Mobe security department. Without hiding the fact that the guy was proud of his father, he only added that, willy-nilly, in that case he would have to win. He assured Shen that the prospects with him would be great, while the boy asked his father again with interest, since that was the first thing that interested him in this conversation. Z confirmed his words, to which Yusheng said that his father was now in prison. He smiled and said that after a few words from him, my father could easily get out of prison if he had not committed any serious offenses. But Yu Shen stopped him and asked if his new friend could extend the sentence. Zhao Zi stood there dumbfounded, completely unexpected to hear such a request, as people usually asked for a shorter sentence. He looked at the guy in surprise and asked again what he meant, but Yu Shen only waved it off indifferently. Zi looked at the boy in bewilderment, not understanding how much one could hate one's own father to put him in prison. The young man leaned back in his seat and looked in the opposite direction, grimacing in displeasure. Yu Sheng looked at the boy curiously, wondering why the gray energy he was trying to summon wasn't emitted this time. The bus that was taking students to the assessment suddenly began to drive outside the city, closer to the mountainside. The hero didn't pay attention to this and continued to stare indifferently out the window, looking at the incredible views. Zhao, in turn, looked out the window and saw that they were no longer in Mobei, after which he exclaimed in surprise why the certification was being held outside of it. He approached the driver, asking if he had taken the wrong route, since there had recently been an incident in Xinhao that made the area very dangerous. The driver smiled and said that there were no mistakes, since the certification location had been changed for the time being, and they were heading to an old factory outside the city. He assured the student that there was no danger, since they had people from Moge with them, and it was much easier to carry out the certification outside the city. After his words, Z calmed down a little and asked the driver to let him know when they would arrive, while the students got some sleep. Something about this situation made Yushin a little wary, but the guy tried not to show it and continued to look out the window. After several hours of travel, the buses stopped and the students found themselves in front of a large old factory that looked abandoned. They started to get off the buses, happy that they had finally reached their destination, and only Yushin was still wary of something. A moment later, the young man saw in front of him a mentor who had also come for certification and was already seriously explaining something to the children. Zhao and Li suddenly cried out that Du Shu, the owner of the 6 pattern talent, had also arrived. All the guys began to turn away from the man, who was noticeably older, and were surprised by his beard, which was quite thick and beautiful. Yushin wasn't really interested in such conversations, so he simply turned around and walked away. Noticing this, Z advised the boy to stay away from Du Shu as he was super strong. The young man exclaimed indifferently, after which Zhao added that he really believed in the boy's victory. The bus driver, holding a cigarette between his teeth, watched from the side as the students carefully examined the factory building. Without even finishing smoking, a moment later he spat it on the ground and stamped it with his foot to put it out. Realizing that the students were not doing anything interesting, the driver turned around and headed in the other direction. He walked into a room where a man was sitting at a table filled with computers and asked him how things were going. A slightly older man, sitting in front of a pile of screens and other electronics, replied that things were not going well. Smiling, the driver told his partner about the low attentiveness, gullibility, and naivety of children, which was just a dream since Moby confirmed his ease of self-management. But the man suddenly pointed his finger at the screen where Yu Sheng was visible on the cameras and said that this guy was not like everyone else. Liu Qingfeng stood in front of the students and gave instructions. Since this time he was the one leading the team, and they needed to wait for the people from the Ministry of Expulsion of the Unclean to announce the topic of the assessment. The mentor noted that this certification was a unique opportunity to prove oneself. He repeated to his students that they had to act with a clear head, since this was the only way they had a chance of success. The teacher looked at Yu Sheng, wondering if the boy would be able to surprise him this time, while he only gazed into the distance with indifference. Suddenly, a loud roar of an engine was heard in the clearing and a huge, dark green SUV burst into the factory grounds. Right in front of a bunch of children, he screeched to a halt and turned off the loud music coming from inside. The door of the Jeep creaked open and a rather large male leg appeared. A second later, a stocky man in uniform stood in front of the children, a cigarette visible between his teeth. The stranger did not hesitate for long and walked towards the teacher, simultaneously looking around with one eye at everyone present. He walked up to Liu, put his hand on his shoulder, and happily asked how he ended up in such a place, since they hadn't seen each other for many years. With a smile on his lips, Liu Qingfeng said that he had started working as a teacher. The stranger's serious grimace instantly disappeared and was replaced by a surprised one, because he did not expect at all that his old friend could become a mentor. But he did not remain in this state for long, and after a minute, taking the cigarette out of his mouth, he added that it was not a bad choice, since it was much safer. The man turned and looked at the pile of children, examining each of them with a keen gaze. A smile appeared on his face again, and he asked his friend if his students were there. The children, in turn, were not delighted with the stranger, not understanding who he was or where he came from. And only Shen's expression remained unchanged. Seeing that none of them were going to speak, the stranger began to approach the students. The first one to cross his path was Yu Shun, who had no intention of stepping aside to let him pass, noticing that the man had asked the boy if he wasn't afraid of him. The boy asked him with a hint of surprise why he should be afraid. The stranger laughed and patted the boy on the shoulder, telling the teacher that this guy was interesting. Finally, the man decided to introduce himself and introduced himself as Luo Tian, after which he said that he was from the Ministry of Expulsion of the impure province of Jiangbei. He added that he would not talk about his other achievements and began talking about the topic of certification. Luo Tian thought, taking a drag on his cigarette and going over in his head a bunch of options on how to check the children. He looked at the group of losers in front of him, which Yu Shun didn't fit into at all, and suddenly an idea came to him. He laughed and said that the boys had to win the fight, after which the winners would stay for certification and everyone else would go home. The students began to whisper among themselves, surprised by such a simple task. Liu Qingfeng, in turn, glanced at his friend and was not at all surprised by such methods, since it was his style. Luo Tian announced the start of the competition, and behind him, the image of a huge beast that looked like a wolf instantly appeared. A second later, the beast turned into a long green dragon, spinning in a circle to form a ring. The man said that whoever gives up or steps outside the ring will be considered defeated. He pointed his finger at the two boys, ordering them to fight first. Xiao Zifeng, one of them, entered the circle and began to warm up his fists, preparing for the fight. A second later, he picked up speed and flew towards his opponent with his fists, shouting a victory slogan. Without leaving his position, the enemy also cried out, preparing for a fierce battle. For the next few minutes, the ring was so dusty that the fighters could not even be seen. The teacher watched this spectacle, thinking that the boys did not have an ounce of fighting strength, since they had never been taught martial arts. Finally, the dust cleared a little, and the spectators saw a beaten Xiao Zifeng, who asked those present not to laugh at his performance, and at his feet lay his opponent, motionless. Luo Tian laughed at the boy's reaction and told him that he had won. Within a second, he pointed his finger at Yu Shun and Du Shu and ordered them to fight next. Du Exu smiled happily and began to roll up his sleeves, mockingly saying that Yu Shun shouldn't even hope to win. The mentor looked after the boy with concentration, keeping in mind the hope that he would be able to surprise him. The guys entered the ring and stood right in the middle, preparing for a fierce battle. Yu Shun raised his hand and asked the crowd if it was permissible to use weapons. Luo Tian smiled and agreed, adding that the boy could use whatever he wanted, to which the boy thanked him. The other students laughed at the guy's strange question, saying that Du Shu would teach him a lesson. Only Jiaozi sincerely supported his friend, shouting slogans of support and believing in his victory. Luo Tian looked respectfully at the most interesting opponents of the day, took the cigarette out of his mouth and ordered them to begin. Hearing the permission, Yu Shun immediately took a stance, tensing up and gathering all his concentration on his opponent. A moment later, the guy pushed off and Du Shu's face suddenly flashed with fear, since he did not expect such a sudden start. With inexpressible fury in his eyes, the guy flew at his opponent, completely ignoring the bat he was holding in his hands. The young man darted past Du Shu and he suddenly felt a sharp growing pain in his arm. The man froze, not understanding what had happened, while blood was already beginning to flow from his hand. The bat fell from his hands and hit the ground with a dull thud, while he finally began to scream in pain. The poor man grabbed his wrist, which had a large cut from the blade that Yu Shun usually used in duels. The frightened Du looked at the wound from which dark red thick blood was flowing faster and faster, causing the man's horror to know no bounds. Yu Shun walked up to the poor guy, put him on his knees and, putting his hand to his face, began to take out a huge dagger from behind his back. With the next deft movement, he knocked the health to the ground and was already accidentally about to stab it with a knife. Even though Du Shu was pinned to the ground and the opponent's hand was on his face, he was still able to beg the guy not to kill him. After all, it was just a battle. However, with his serious expression, Yu Shun made it clear that his intentions were final. Suddenly, the guy swung, and with all his might thrust the knife into a place that was a centimeter from the opponent's head, causing him to squeal as if he was being cut. After realizing that he was still alive, tears poured from the man's eyes, and he asked the guy in a trembling voice if he was kidding him. Yu Shun also hovered over his helpless body, and Luo Tian, in turn smiling, began to approach the guys. Instantly, the young man squeezed both of his opponent's cheeks tightly, making it so that he could not close his mouth. He stuck a few fingers into his mouth as if he was trying to find something there, and Shu watched in fear. This scene was still being watched by the now confused Luo Tian, who did not understand what was happening, and therefore asked the guy what he was doing. In an instant, the guy pulled out one of his back teeth, causing him to squeal in pain. Yu Sheng looked at the empty tooth in surprise, wondering why there was no poison in it. Luo Tian asked the boy, slightly confused, if he was looking for poison, to which the boy agreed, and grabbing Du Xiu's hair, finally lifted him up. The young man began to rummage through his pockets, under his clothes and in all possible places where he could have hidden the poison, but it was not there. Surprised by this scene, the ministry representative finally decided to intervene, asking if there was a possibility that Zhu did not have any poison at all. Taking a break from his task for a moment, Yu Sheng said that if the man were captured by an enemy and he did not have poison, his suffering would be worse than death. Poor Du lay there and mentally reproached himself for not having really hidden the poison. Because if he had, he wouldn't have had to endure all this torture. But a moment later, he rejected such thoughts because he loved his wonderful life and did not want to die at all. Understanding what was going on, Luo Tian asked the young man if he was from a criminal city, to which the boy agreed and asked if people really didn't hide poison outside of it. Having confirmed his doubts, Lo returned to his old friend and asked him if he knew the boy's place of origin, to which the teacher only asked him if it had anything to do with the boy. Lu Qingfeng scratched his head and calmly said that, according to the rules, heinous crimes were not taken into account because they were not discussed after they were released. The mentor came close to his friend and looked him intently in the eyes, after which he added that this would be applied if the student did not kill again. Finally, he firmly said that without a single day of mistakes, the boy would forever remain his student. Tian turned around and headed towards his car, throwing out that his enemies were evil spirits, not people, so Liu Qing could forget about it, because for today the competition was over. On the way to the car, he added that testing would continue tomorrow and that the students would have to spend the night at the plant, since it was large and there was plenty of room to sleep. Opening the car door, Lo suddenly offered the teacher a drink, since they had not seen each other for a long time, but the man said that his students were still in his care. Realizing that the number would be dull, he simply got into the car and for some reason remembered Yu Sheng. Luo looked at Liu Qingfeng with surprise and said that it was difficult for him to say whether the boy would pass the test. A huge pile of healthy white rats ran across the floor of the ancient factory, tirelessly searching for scraps of food. Watching this, the upset students did not want to spend the night there at all, because the factory was very dirty and smelly. Instantly, Zhao Ze approached the teacher who was sitting by the wall and said that he did not understand one thing. The mentor looked at the guy with interest, and he, in turn, asked why no one from the ministry even looked at their talents. The boy was very upset about this because at school they always repeated that talent was directly proportional to the level of patterns in the future. Liu Qing didn't think long about his answer, so he said that talent had never led to the top without some kind of reinforcement. But hanging his head a little, he added in despair that there was a shortage of geniuses anywhere. Little by little, other students began to approach the teacher and listen to him as he told them that with such a large population, the appearance of a genius was a common occurrence. He stood up and said that if only talent were needed, people would have overcome evil spirits long ago. During his life, the teacher met many geniuses, but few of them actually made it into a good life. Zhao didn't like his words at all, saying that it was too arrogant to consider one's talent an unusual gift and to put oneself above others, because such people usually made mistakes in ordinary things. Looking at Du Xiu, he said that the lucky ones from the famous schools entered into a pledge of obedience to the unclean and, due to their own fear, did not kill anyone, after which they got rid of their own heads. Suddenly, the mentor cried out that this world lacked more geniuses, and in Mog, anyone was stronger than children, but the price for this was incredible. After that, Liu Qingfeng remembered the 4 great outposts where human life meant nothing, and only monsters reigned. Human life there was cheaper than a sip of water, and also than a piece of bread. He put his hand on his heart and said that without determination, a cool head and sufficient attentiveness, it was impossible to survive there. The gloomy disciples stood and silently listened to their mentor, deep down understanding that the path they had chosen was not so easy. Liu Qing sat down in his old place again and ordered everyone to rest before tomorrow's assessment. But Zhao suddenly came up to him and said that he couldn't sleep there because of the dirt, and besides, he wasn't tired. Suddenly, the teacher's calm expression changed to an irritated one and he shamed the boy for his disgust. He sternly ordered all the students to sit down and declared that, compared to the 4 outposts, this composition was just a trifle. The teacher pointed his finger at Yushun, who was sitting quietly on the floor, setting him up as an example to all the children. Hearing that they were talking about him, he opened his eyes and looked at everyone else in surprise. At that very moment, he saw dozens of eyes from other students staring at him in the same surprised manner, which made him a little embarrassed. He didn't like this situation very much, so the guy finally decided to get up. Chaozi asked him in surprise where he went, to which he dryly replied that he was going to the toilet. Looking after him, Jaseo thought out loud that although the guy was a little gloomy, this did not make him bad. And the girl standing next to him raised her eyebrows in surprise. The guy looked at her with a skeptical expression and, with his mouth open, realized that this was a complete fatality. Yushin, at that time, was carefully hiding around the corner of one of the pavilions of the old factory. He peered around the corner cautiously and saw a camera pointed straight at him. The young man turned back and thought that this should have been the last camera on his way. He was looking for a place where there were no cameras, since the entire plant was covered in them. When it finally dawned on him, the young man immediately jumped into action, carefully moving towards the part of the building he needed. He carefully walked up to the half-open door and looked inside, seeing another cell there, which was already the 10th. Yusheng desperately moved on, looking for another room that might interest him a little more. Finally, the guy reached another white door, from behind which someone's familiar voices were heard. Without any fear at all, the young man carefully took hold of the handle and opened the door a little to better hear those inside. From there, a conversation between 2 men could immediately be heard, one of whom was asking the other if he had information about Liu Qingfeng. One of the men wondered if the mentor was one of the guardians of the Pledge of Obedience who was unclean, since in that case he was simply wasting his talent in that place. Yu Sheng listened carefully as the men talked about transferring the teacher to the provincial center, since his teaching methods were worth considering. Suddenly, the bus driver sitting on the sofa noticed that the door to the room was ajar and someone was standing behind it. The husband smiled slightly, thinking in his head that the guy really was funny. Shen, in turn, decided not to waste his own time on such meaningless conversations and returned to the factory premises where the others were. As he passed by Liu Qingfeng, he suddenly decided to respond and asked the boy if he had prepared the Wolf Hermit's plan. The guy ignored the question and headed outside to the familiar wall to sit down. The silence and peace of the deep night was suddenly broken by a loud crash and other sounds that seriously made those present wary. The young man immediately stood up and looked tensely into the distance, trying to make out something under the white moonlight. Without thinking twice, he grabbed the crossbow that was standing next to him, loaded it, and prepared to defend himself. The boy looked hopefully at the teacher, who made it clear with his whole appearance that this did not bother him and that the young man would have to cope on his own. Realizing this, Yu Sheng headed towards the exit, while the mentor thought to himself that the fate of hermits was usually tragic. On the mountain at the foot of which the factory was located stood Luo Tian, who was holding a huge dog tightly on a leash. The man laughed, preparing to teach a lesson to those who decided to sleep in the open air and let everyone understand what the awakened ones were faced with. Without pulling the cat by the tail, Tian let go of the huge chain wrapped around the dog's neck, and it fell with a dull ringing sound. The mad dog immediately took off and flew towards the plant, his whole appearance predicting trouble. Seeing a huge dog on camera that looked like a real demon, the men simply went crazy, not understanding how Lo wanted the students to kill the evil spirits. The confused guards began calling out to the bus driver, begging the captain to wake up. He, in turn, only slightly moving his cap aside, ordered them not to panic and to sit down in their seats. Yawning sleepily, he said that one demon wouldn't cause much trouble, especially since it was time for the students to show off the abilities they had been taught at school. One of the men historically screamed that the captain did not think about the consequences at all because the demons really were life-threatening. With a very irritated look, the bus driver took and carefully pushed aside part of his jacket, trying to show something. A strange symbol appeared on his shoulder, and after showing it, the man added that it was the thing that would decide whether there would be trouble that night. Without really worrying, he lit a cigarette and said that a little activity would be good for the children, as they would be able to show off their talents, which the caretaker eventually accepted. Within a minute, the huge dog was right in the pavilion where the poor children were resting. With screams and squeals, they desperately tried to escape from him, saving their own lives. The poor fellows screamed in fear and called for help, not understanding where the demon came from. The mad dog growled and tore everything in its path, leaving nothing whole. In this horror, Du Shu finally decided to intervene, loudly declaring that he would try to protect the children. Seeing a stick in his hands, that is, a potentially dangerous object, the demon immediately growled at the guy. Not even a moment had passed before he knocked the piece of wood out of Du's hands with all his might and left a huge rag on his hand, causing him to fly away. Zhao Zi suddenly appeared in front of the wounded man, trying to calm everyone down and encourage them to fight together. In order to save Du Shu, he hit the dog in the face with great force, giving the man the opportunity to get up. The fearless guy stood in front of the poor man and looked menacingly at the dog, saying once again that it would be much more difficult for him to defeat everyone, so they needed to work together. From afar, Liu Qingfeng watched the screams of the terrible disciples as they tried to defend themselves from the evil spirits, preferring to return home alive. The teacher stared menacingly straight into the camera above him and tried to shame the observers by asking whether they really thought this was good for the children. On one of the computer screens, Zhao was seen with Du Shu, bravely resisting the dog. The captain watched them and was amazed at their courage, despite their obvious lack of talent, since the strongest part of a hellhound was its head. But instantly, thoughts of Yu Shen appeared in his head, who seriously irritated the man because it was he who had not been in the confrontation until now. Suddenly, the man walked up to the door and pulled the handle, saying that the guards didn't need to look for him at all if they were office rats. The gloomy figure of a young man appeared behind the door again, looking at the man indifferently and brazenly, ignoring the captain's question whether he had just come to sit. The stunned guards were quite surprised by the guy's appearance, not understanding how he found them, to which he reminded them of their tracks. The puzzled men could not understand how they could have reached the care room following such vague tracks. One of them asked the boy why he didn't go help his classmates, but the young man confidently replied that they would survive in any case. The bus driver sternly said that the children would die without his help, since he had no intention of helping them either. Yu Shen said indifferently that the hellhound was weak, so in any case, his classmates had a chance of winning. In a state of despair, the captain shouted that he would deliberately increase the hound's strength, but the boy continued to react calmly to this and be convinced of the opposite. He mentioned Article 75 of the Criminal Code of Moj, which deals with premeditated murder and the punishment of 7 years for its commission. The man gradually began to give up his position, so he asked the boy if he would save his friends if the captain himself decided to help. The observers standing behind their boss looked at each other, thinking that he was really getting nervous. But the guy was not subject to provocations, and therefore shook his head, saying that he would not save. Not understanding how the boy could be so selfish, the driver historically shouted that he was unwell because he wanted to watch his classmates die. Yu Sheng was smarter, and therefore said that it was better for him to go to the police and get a monetary reward than to die with them because he could not cope with the captain. He told the captain about Moj's school policy, which called for a huge reward for informing on a student killer during a mission. Without changing his indifferent expression, the guy added that after killing 10 students, an arrest warrant would be issued for a particularly dangerous criminal, as a result of which he would be able to get 10. The young man asked the captain again if he was going to kill the children, but the man could not find any sensible answer to such a question, so he simply stood silently. A picture popped into the driver's mind of himself and 2 men standing on top of a hill in the middle of the deep, dark expanses of the night. In anticipation of something great, they loudly addressed the god of the night, the great sovereign. The captain spread his arms wide and said with a smile that the starlight washed over them that night and God was 100% watching over them. He raised his hands up and said that the success of their plan, by which they could become slaves of God, would be the greatest favor to them. Changing his expression to a menacing and stern one, the man shouted loudly that the disciples from Mobei were destined to die that night. All the others shouted in unison, repeating after their leader and raising their hands up, turning to God. They folded their hands together and, closing their eyes, began to pray to God, calling the lives of their children payment for their sins. The captain stepped forward and said contentedly that in half an hour they would begin what they had planned. The head of the department, Moj Lin, sat behind his huge desk signing another document with a serious expression on his face. Suddenly, his phone, which was standing to the side, vibrated, and a call screen from an unknown number appeared on the screen. The man picked up the phone, slightly irritated, and on the other end they started talking to him about some kind of agreement. Slightly interested in what the stranger was trying to tell him, Lin looked up from his documents and allowed his interlocutor to continue. The chief turned on the speakerphone and put the phone on the table, and from there came the voice of a man who was hinting that the city security should let the motorcade of cars that would be leaving in 10 minutes pass without any problems. Continuing his work, the man asked if they were talking about heretics, to which the interlocutor agreed, calling them the heresy of 1,000 gods. Lin rolled his eyes and irritably ordered the stranger to announce the price of the question, still not looking up from the document in front of him. The voice on the other side spoke about the assessment that the chief had organized, including in Mobay City, where it had not yet been completed, and then asked if the 12 students would not be a problem. In a menacing voice, he said that in any agreement there was always a guarantor, and without knowing information about him, the boss would simply have no choice. The stranger on the other side identified himself as the customer, after which Lin threatened him with problems if at least one student died. In conclusion, he added that in 6 months, the Jianbei provinces would rise up and destroy their sect if the agreement was violated. The bus driver thought about Yu Sheng's words and thought that he had lost 300,000 since each student was paid 30,000. The guy, in turn, asked the man if he could copy the recording for him, which surprised the captain a little, asking him again what the purpose was. The guy said that during the certification, the answers were unknown, and therefore, after the erroneous thoughts about the danger and then the rescue, for 12 people, it would have been possible to get 360,000 xian. The irritated captain shouted at the boy that this was unfair to his classmates and promised to report him to Moog. The observers, who had been standing behind him until now, decided to take advantage of the moment and suck up to the boss, praising his severity. Yu Xin turned around and walked towards the exit, saying at the end that he would give half to the captain. The husband laughed, immediately assuring the boy that he would solve all the problems in a moment, and the guards, who only supported his severity, remained standing silently with crooked expressions on their faces. Chao Zi and Du Su tried to resist the mad dog, but their strength was gradually exhausted. At such a tense moment, Zhao suddenly remembered Yu Sheng, saying that if the guy had appeared at that moment, he would have called him father. Suddenly, slow steps were heard behind them, approaching them with every second. Both turned around to see who had come and were incredibly surprised by what they saw. Yu Shen stood in front, his eyes blazing with white flames, and in front of him, the hellhound growled just as viciously. As he had sworn, Jiaozi quietly called the boy father, not believing that his wish had come true so quickly. The young man looked at his friend in surprise and said indifferently that it was not at all proper for him to throw around such words, to which the latter did not even pay attention and asked Shen where he had been. The guy scratched the back of his head and yawned, saying that he had been to the toilet, pretending that nothing had happened. Z immediately shouted that the guy was lying, since it was simply impossible not to hear such a noise, to which the young man agreed and apologized, because he was not really one of the best at lying. Du Su and Yu Shen remained standing silently, not knowing what to say or do, so they simply stared at Shen. The guy himself stood calmly next to the hellhound and wasn't even afraid of it, while the dog didn't react to him either. Du and Zhao were stunned by this turn of events, as the young man had walked past the mad dog without even looking at him. Just like the hound, Du Su made a dissatisfied expression and told Zhao that he thought they would be safer together. After these words, Yu Shen took over the courtyard and began to think about how to save others. He looked up at his new comrades and asked if he could have seriously hurt them. The poor people stood before him and did not know what to answer, trying to think of all the options of what the young man was going to do. In just a moment, Zhao Zi was on all fours, clutching his heart with his right hand and screaming loudly in pain. Yu Sheng looked at Du Xiu with a hinting glance, who, understanding what the boy meant, sighed heavily and resigned himself. A few seconds later, the man also began to roll around on the cold floor, clutching his lower back and groaning in pain, attracting the attention of the students around him. Seeing such a wonderful scene in the background, Yu Sheng looked at the lens of the camera that was watching over all of this. After this, he stood before the hound and began to shout a speech, solemnly recalling the furious demon that had terrorized his comrades, and telling how they, the youth of Moga, had once sworn to protect people at the cost of their lives. Since the hellhound didn't quite understand the guy, it didn't care about his big words at all, so the demon growled and tried to pounce on the guy again. The captain watched this touching picture on the computer screen, thinking that upon seeing this, Mog would immediately become upset and send money. The observers also stood behind him, watching the movie on the screen, and the driver was considering whether it was really worth giving the young man so much room to maneuver. Suddenly, one of the guards looked at the picture on the screen more closely, after which his expression immediately changed to one of incredible bewilderment. He immediately grabbed the captain by the shoulder, pointed his finger at the computer and ordered him to look. On the other side, Yusheng could clearly be seen fighting the demon, shouting loudly that protecting his comrades was his sacred duty and that the Human Torch would never go out again. The bus driver was amazed beyond measure, as the guy really played to the crowd divinely. The guy, in turn, continued the performance, covering Zhao with himself and saying that bad consequences would have awaited his friends if he had not appeared in time. Such a wonderful game immediately angered the captain, because the young man could simply not be believed and he would deprive the husband of his boot. Instantly, the camera hanging under the stele began to move, and Yusheng, noticing this, realized that it was time to finish. A terrible demon, in the form of a hellhound, lay motionless in the middle of a huge pavilion, and around it, at a distance of 10 meters, stood the frightened poor students. Zhao Zi looked at the dog and tried to comprehend that this was indeed the end of the horror they had just experienced. At that time, Du Shou thought that although they were all disciples, there was a huge gap between them, which showed them their helplessness. The door to the train swung open and a human figure appeared, loudly shouting that all the gods of the world were with him. In the middle of the pavilion stood an eccentric man in torn clothes, and above his head hung a bowl, around which everything glowed, when he himself said that he had given new souls to the gods. Zhao Zi was the first to realize that it was a first-level awakened being, which didn't exactly make the guy happy. The disciples, who had been frightened until then, were truly surprised when they realized that he was a heretic, since they did not understand where he had come from. Suddenly, the bowl above the eccentric's head began to shine and glow with an even brighter light, causing some to even close their eyes. Zhao returned to Du Shu and said that the heretics had killed mercilessly, so they could only hope that this was not the subject of the assessment. But despite this, Zi knew that the awakened first level was much stronger than the Hellhound, so they only had one hope. At that very moment, everyone instantly turned towards Yusheng, looking at him with eyes that were definitely hinting at something. The circus did not make the young man wait long, and so in a moment the students grabbed different parts of their bodies and fell down, complaining of terrible pain after the battle. Zhao Zi, thinking that this was one of his smartest concessions, smiled rather. Yusheng, in turn, was not at all taken aback and, as always, told the stranger that killing people was prohibited by law. But the weirdo, it seemed, did not even pay attention to these words, so a moment later he rushed at the young man with shouts first. The boy dodged his blow at the last second, and the man smashed his magic bowl on the concrete floor. Having punched a hole in it, his eyes lit up with a red flame, and the awakened one said that such skills would definitely please the gods. After these words, the man raised his head and saw absolutely no one in front of him. The baby simply disappeared into thin air. Yusheng, who had already successfully aimed his own crossbow at the bastard, asked again why killing was forbidden. The man, without thinking twice, decided that he would first kill all the other students present, causing them all to squeal and scream. The stranger seemed possessed. He kept repeating that the gods were with him, and their flickering was eternal. However, this show was about to come to an end, as Yusheng suddenly appeared behind him, holding a small blade in his hands. The next second, the guy ran the blade across the man's back while he didn't even have time to dodge, because such a blow was completely unexpected. The guy jumped to the other side, also running the blade, but this time along the pagan's hand, causing him to almost drop the magic bowl. The awakened one did not even understand what had happened at first, and only after some time began to scream in pain, seeing a pile of blood gushing from his hand. He froze in one place and squealed, while the young man deftly jumped to the other side. There was nothing in his eyes except anger and a thirst for justice, because no one had the right to kill innocent people outside the criminal city. Having caught his breath, the first one gathered his strength again and attacked the guy, swinging his eccentric bowl at him. The last thing he managed to do before his fatal fall, as the young man stepped back, was to shout death threats at him. Dozens of times after that, the man tried to get to Yusheng and somehow teach him a lesson, but it was all in vain, because the guy was much more agile. The captain watched all this with a stern, concentrated gaze and understood that heresy had nevertheless found a way to return. He grabbed the microphone and shouted for Luo Yun to deal with the heretic who appeared during the assessment, as this could end very badly. Hearing this, Liu Qingfeng shouted loudly to Yusheng that killing heretics had been allowed in the human world, finally giving the pair the green light. The teacher watched the boy from the side and was amazed at his skills, which not every adult possessed. He shouted again that the law did not prohibit the killing of heretics, but on the contrary gave a reward of 100,000. Finally, having calculated the final strategy of action, the guy rushed towards the first one and took control of the situation. He grabbed the man's arm so tightly that he couldn't move it, and all he could do was obey. The bastard, not expecting such a move, lost his balance and successfully flew to the ground, bending under the guy's counterattack. The confidence on his face instantly turned to fear and confusion as he felt another blade touch his neck and cut it in half. The bastard fell to the concrete floor, and a bright red pool of blood quickly began to appear under his head, which was the last thing he saw. The disciples who stood and watched this were simply shocked by the fact that Yu Sheng had just killed him. Everyone immediately started whispering to each other about how incredibly cruel the guy was, while he just as emotionlessly stood over the man's body and looked straight at him. Suddenly, he returned to the teacher and asked why he had never seen the law he had told him about. The mentor said sternly that only one who had awakened could understand the rules. Xu, who was looking at the dead body in shock, instantly shouted loudly that Yu Sheng had just taken someone's life. The mentor returned to him and angrily shamed the young man for trying to blame Yu Sheng, since everyone present in the pavilion had agreed to kill at the time. Liu Qingfeng shouted loudly that if it weren't for Yu Sheng, everyone present would have been dead long ago. He strictly ordered the children to look at the dead body, at its wounds, its eyes, and to look into the face of fear, which would help them win. The first to respond was Zhao Zi, who said that he was not afraid at all because his father was the head of the security department. Everyone else supported the guy and loudly said that they were not afraid either, just like Zhao. After drawing some conclusions from everything that had happened, the teacher said that some of the students would be better off returning to normal life, so they were returning to school tomorrow. After that, he returned to Yu Sheng and quickly threw the boy to follow him. They were walking around the factory under a black starry sky when the teacher asked the boy if he had any experience of killing, to which he agreed. The mentor looked closely at his student and asked when this happened for the first time, but the boy did not remember the exact date, so he said that at 5-6 years old. Deep down, Liu Qingfeng felt sorry for the little boy because he had started down such a dirty path at an incredibly young age. Suddenly, the guy said that in a criminal city, killing was not prohibited at all. Putting a cigarette in his mouth, the teacher added dejectedly that Shen was the best of all those he had met, and his talents could become invincible. He lit a cigarette and said that he had no intention of commenting on his past, but believed in the boy's good heart. The mentor ordered the boy to never point a gun at people, but Shen Ula's answer was rather ambiguous, although he agreed. Realizing this, the mentor turned in his direction and looked the guy straight in the eyes with an astonished look. He said that for his good deed he should receive a reward from Moj, at which the teacher smiled and said that he would definitely give him money if Moj refused to pay. The boy took the dagger in his hands and approached the demon, and when the teacher asked him what he wanted to do, he said that he was going to cut up the evil spirit and then sell it. The mentor told the young man that the evil spirit that had just recently transformed was cheap, but the meat in it was bitter. The guy exclaimed and, as always, emotionlessly, headed towards the warehouse building, shoving his hands in his pockets. Luo Tian approached Liu Qingfeng and said sternly that he was only resolving a small misunderstanding. The teacher looked at him with distrust and asked sarcastically if he could really be relied on. Luo Tian smiled and said that the man shouldn't have put off the young man's assessment reward because he would be angry, especially if he found out that the teacher had taken the reward. After looking around and checking to see if he had a tail, the guy returned and headed to the room he knew. Before opening the door and entering, he looked back once more and, having made sure, entered the room. There he was met with a huge smile by the bus driver, who kindly introduced himself as Wang Wen Xuan and fussed about how they could resolve the situation together. The man cheerfully stated that they were getting double the reward for teamwork, but such words only angered Yu Sheng, and he sternly said that such cooperation did not count. The smile had already faded a little from the captain's face, and the thought had appeared in his head that the guy, it turns out, had a point about honesty. Realizing this, Wang Wen again added excitedly that he was the guy's eternal patron, and he could always turn to him if someone stood in his way to wealth. Noticing the hint, the young man coldly said that he would immediately report the man to Moga if he even thought about murder. He chuckled and said that after that his determination had disappeared somewhere, and Yu Sheng himself, in turn, stood and thought about who it would be better for him to cooperate with next time. The captain finally walked away from him, and the boy immediately thought about the third point of the criminal city's code, which ordered never to get close to idiots. Finally, after such a hard and long night, the incredibly long-awaited warm morning arrived. The body of the awakened one was still lying in the middle of the pavilion, and Du Shu and Zhao Zi were sitting around it. The students were also watching this scene when suddenly the door of the pavilion swung open and the bus driver quickly entered. He turned to the disciples and joyfully announced that they were going home, which made them happy. Literally, an hour later, the children were already sitting on the bus, looking out of their window with slightly sad looks. Suddenly, Zhao Zi, who was sitting next to Yu Sheng, took and kicked him with his elbow. Turning to the guy, he turned to his friend and told him that as soon as he returned home, he would immediately help him with his problem. But Shen did not even immediately understand what he was talking about. Suddenly, the guy remembered that on the way to the certification, he asked his friend to extend the term for his father. Yu Sheng agreed, and Chaozi's joy in the depths of his soul knew no bounds, since the guy was truly happy that the guy allowed him, and even thanked him. Suddenly, someone grabbed Yu Sheng's right shoulder, pulling him back slightly. From the side, Du Xiu's face appeared, saying that he wanted to become like Shen, and therefore asked to be taught how to kill. A little depressed, the young man said that the guy had a good heart and he sincerely did not understand why he wanted to kill, because it was illegal. Du smiled and said that his language skills were not so good, but what he meant was that he wanted to become stronger. In all seriousness, the guy came back to him and in a serious tone said that he should pollinate, and after that he would become incredibly stronger. Finally, after several hours of travel, the bus finally arrived in Mobe and joyful students began to get off, just like the driver, trying to catch up with Yu Shen. He clapped his hands and laughed, saying that they had really had a great time, but the guy didn't react to such a friendly address. A little irritated, he returned to his husband and said that he had just gotten off the bus, and he, taking the hint, calmed down and decided not to rush him. The young man confidently opened the door to the director's office and loudly announced that he had completed the task. The director said that he had heard about his success, but the results of the assessment had not yet arrived, and, according to the rules of the agreement, its conditions had to be fulfilled after the final decision. The young man returned to the driver and asked him what he thought about where the boy might have ended up, and the captain, in turn, said loudly that he was in the first place. Yu Shen returned to the director again and firmly said that he was the one in first place. The man looked at the guy in surprise, not understanding how he could ask some passerby such information. But despite this, he smiled awkwardly and asked who the man was who came with the guy. Taking advantage of the situation, Yu Xing claimed that the driver was from the provinces and decided everything at that certification. The director immediately began to apologize to the driver, squeeze his hand and shower such a young and promising provincial worker with compliments. However, after this, as always, the man began to complain that their small town lived incredibly poorly, without money and resources, and all that was left for them was to watch young talents. The director whispered to his secretary to bring some tea, and he himself, smiling, asked what department such a highly respected official was from. The driver took a cup of tea in his hands and looked a little embarrassed and said that it was from the reserves. The director repeated the last word of his sentence to himself again, because it seemed to him that he had not heard it well. But realizing that he had made the right decision, the man immediately took the cup of tea from Wang Wen and took it back, leaving the captain standing behind and feeling out of place. Somewhat irritated, he returned to his desk and asked sarcastically why he hadn't told him earlier that he was from the reserves. But without any intention of answering such a question, Yu Sheng simply extended his hand and asked where his promised destiny was. With complete reluctance and a wry expression on his face, the director threw several bright emerald-colored stones onto his hand. The young man looked at them with satisfaction and squeezed them tightly in his fist, proud of his work. They didn't waste much time in the director's office, so they left and headed further down the long corridor. Instantly, the young man's phone vibrated in his pocket, so the guy had to take it out and pick up the receiver. Xiaozi's cheerful voice could be heard from the other side, calling Shen's father an incredibly cool guy. The guy said that when he visited his father in prison, he could only find him on one policewoman, who had thought on her hand. But after this, Zhao added with satisfaction that under his leadership, his father's crime was successfully reclassified as more serious, and therefore he will not be released anytime soon. Yu Sheng was delighted by such wonderful news and praised his friend, as he had indeed completed his task perfectly. Meanwhile, Shen and the captain finally reached the secret ministry and entered its main hall, confidently walking towards the counter. Wang Wen looked around in admiration and carefully examined the ornaments on the walls of the ministry, which were truly striking in their beauty. At the main reception desk sat a pretty girl who listened to customers with a gentle smile and tried to help them. Suddenly, the young lady noticed two eccentrics standing right in the middle of the main hall, and something about them made her wary. Finally, The girl understood why the face of the adult man seemed so familiar to her, because she could not understand how he ended up there. She quickly picked up the phone and reported to her husband on the other side that the sick van had come to the ministry again. The worker sitting at the next counter, hearing this, immediately shouted about an emergency and all the counters suddenly closed for a temporary break. The visitors stood there in bewilderment, not understanding what had just happened, since literally a minute ago absolutely all the stands had been working. Yusheng at that time was watching the captain and thinking that those who were chattering were not to be trusted at all. After all, this was the first rule of the criminal city. Suddenly, an agitated girl approached the counter and began asking the worker for help, since her captain had gone on a dangerous mission and ended up in the hospital. The young lady behind the counter sternly ordered the girl not to panic and to tell the situation again, but more calmly. The poor thing, through her tears, began to talk about the reward that was given to those who fought against heresy. And if her captain died, all of them would not survive without him. The worker placed a large book on the stand and told the girl that she needed to check their company policy. She quickly began to leaf through a bunch of pages that, it seemed, no one had opened for a very, very long time. Finally, she pointed to one of the pages and said that such an award did exist, but the soldier had to record video evidence. The girl placed a small thing on the counter that looked very much like a flash drive and handed it to the employee. The stranger tried to squeeze out a small smile, and the worker, in turn, took the flash drive and thanked her. She plugged it into the monitor and quickly typed something on the keyboard, after which the video finally appeared on the screen. The video clearly showed how an unknown man was giving the devils to a company of 3 guys who were barely standing on their feet after the fight. The girl began to cry again and begged the young lady to help her with the task, but the worker had no such rights, although she really wanted to help. Suddenly, a new idea appeared in her head, and so the girl jumped up and said that she would go look for a manager who could help the poor guy. Yusheng and the bus driver were still watching all of this, and for some reason he didn't look very well at the worker who ran after the boss. Suddenly, a thought flashed through his head, and without thinking for long, the man threw in the towel that he would take the risk, because money was everything to him. He ran to the counter screaming for help, telling the story of the poor young lady exactly the same. While ordering the worker to give him a letter of recommendation, he looked hopefully at Shen behind him, hoping that he would help him. Instantly, the guy's face changed from emotionless and indifferent to more excited and even a little scared. Behind the captain's back, a huge figure of a man instantly appeared, his eyes blazing with rage. Shen felt like it was the commander of Bai Chengcheng's guard that Wang Wen had mentioned earlier. And the captain himself, feeling heavy breathing, suddenly lost all his courage and determination. The man understood that at that moment his life was hanging by a thin thread, and so he tried to come up with something that would save him. Pretending that he had not yet noticed the commander behind him, Wang Wen began to glorify and idolize his husband, hoping that he would take pity on him after the false claims of his death. The girl behind the counter eventually got tired of listening to such nonsense, so the girl cursed the man and chased him away. Suddenly, the captain finally heard the commander's caustic question from behind him about how he dared to say that he was dead. Wang Wen immediately returned and actually saw Chen Yimo, who had once been his commander and then retired, standing in front of him. Compared to the huge man, Wang Wen looked like a grain of sand that was as weak and useless as possible. Unfazed by the desire to live, the bus driver grabbed the big guy's hand tightly and sweetly clapped that he would now explain everything to him. The captain reached out to the commander's ear and whispered something to him, which made the commander seriously surprised, asking again if the one Van had told him about was really that cool. The husband nodded his head and confirmed his words, after which he added that he was a real rich man. Chen Yimo glared at Yusheng and looked at him with an appraising gaze that seemed somewhat wary. Suddenly, the man began to approach the guy, and when he came up, he extended his hand to him, said hello, and introduced himself. But the young man had no intention of squeezing his hand, so the commander decided to put it on his shoulder and tell him with a smile that the boy should immediately inform him about those who insulted him in Bangchengchen. Yusheng dodged his palm and said coldly that he didn't like fights at all, unlike money. Chen Yimo laughed and said that he swears on his head that the guy will get his money. Having loudly declared that it was now his turn, the man with a slight smile headed towards one of the stands where a girl with a flash drive was standing. Finally, the worker appeared in the hall together with the boss, who was confidently walking towards the counter where the poor young lady was. The security commander, in turn, was already loudly continuing Wang Wen's story, trying to get some money, while the boss and the employee stood and stared at him in bewilderment. Although the boss understood that the strong man was a hero of the war with demons, all he did every day was twiddle his thumbs. He asked Chen to wait while he dealt with the girl that the worker had already pointed out to him. The man was incredibly nervous about the fact that such a talented young and old generation had gathered in his office. Pointing angrily at the girl and the commander, he shouted at the worker to blacklist them because they were thieves. Turning around and heading to his office, he added that the commander could not complete any of his tasks, after which he began to loudly complain and object behind his back. Chen Yimo grabbed Yusheng, hugged his shoulder and pulled him towards himself, brazenly asking the boss if he knew who this guy was. The boss came back and asked the commander about the guy in disbelief, while Yusheng couldn't understand how the boss could deny the reserve officer and commander who had awakened 6 times and clearly had the highest rank. Chen Yi, without delay, began to tell that Shen was his good friend, who shed blood and killed evil spirits for the sake of humanity. The boss, hearing these words, turned around and smiled slyly, remembering a little so. He mockingly shouted to the commander that if he gave money to people like them every day, Moja would simply go bankrupt. Now enraged, Chen Yimo sternly shouted at the impudent man that he would not do anything even close to him. The men immediately rushed at each other, but their path was suddenly blocked by a huge table. Seeing such a wonderful sight, Yusheng cleared his throat in embarrassment, politely asking if he could add a few words. Without waiting for an answer, the guy began to talk about one of Moja's laws, according to which those who fought in the city were to be imprisoned for 6 months and had to pay a fine of 100,000. Chen Yimo looked at the youth in shock and exclaimed that he had not signed such orders. But Yu Sheng, in turn, continued to say that he had applied to carry out the task, and according to the law on the protection of rights, he simply could not be refused. This strange behavior came as a surprise to Chen Ai, so he asked Wang Wen in confusion if the guy was right in the head. The guy told his boss to watch the certification video, to which he indignantly stated that under no circumstances would he watch it or give the guy a task. However, the worker decided not to take any risks and turn on the video from the flash drive that Shen gave her. She looked at it carefully and added that the video showed signs of editing. The young man agreed with her and asked to call a specialist to analyze the situation, since the forces were unequal and the students would lose without his help. Having seen what was on the video, the chief dryly ordered the young lady to let the young man through and give him a full reward in accordance with the standards. The girl immediately listened to the boss and began her usual work. She clicked something on the computer and a second later, smiling, informed the guy that the money would be deposited into his account within the next few days. The guy thanked the worker, turned around, and coldly asked his boss why he had changed his mind so abruptly. The husband sternly asked him if the guy planned to work in the secret ministry, but at the moment Yu Sheng had no such plans. He handed the boy a business card and added that he was an assistant to Minister Moj, and if the boy decided to join the secret ministry, his career would not end there. Seeing this, Chen Yimo was seriously indignant and, calling the chief a name, threatened to punish him because it was unheard of for a reserve commander to be refused because of some brat. The man looked after his boss and did not understand why he did this, but he did not dwell on these thoughts for long. An enraged Chen stood up and immediately clapped for Yu Sheng, saying that next time he would definitely provide him with a large sum of money. The commander grabbed Wang Wen by the shoulder and pulled him along, sternly saying that it was time for them to leave, while the man did not understand how they could just leave the money behind. Baring his teeth, the officer menacingly asked the captain how he still had the nerve to want money. Finally, after so many adventures, Yu Shen had the opportunity to return to school. As soon as he entered the courtyard, he was immediately noticed by Zhao Zi, who happily, but a little excitedly, ran up to his friend. The guy started telling him that during the boy's absence from school, absolutely the entire management had changed because they had won the certification, but at the same time, 2 other schools did not agree with this. Zhao looked at the young man happily and added that with his return, everything would definitely get better and together, they would be able to overcome everything. Yushen looked at him with interest, and after a second he asked if the young man was ready for this. Zhao smiled sheepishly and in order to change the subject, said that Shen was being looked for by teacher Lu Tu, who was at a cafe near the school at the time, which even surprised the guy a little. Without delay, Yushen went to the breakfast cafe, where the teacher really liked to go. He approached the mentor and asked why he was looking for him, to which he only pointed towards the waiter who was serving the dishes. Yushen knew that man because all his classmates called him Lame Wang. Liu Qingfeng brought a glass of water to his lips and asked the guy what he thought of that waiter. Shen returned to him and said that he had no thoughts because he did not know the waiter that well. Teacher Liu began to tell that the lame Wang was once a reserve officer and trained there for 2 years. But because some data was not enough, he was sent to the Pledge of the East. On the 3rd day of his stay there, the poor man was attacked by evil spirits, and his leg was broken, so the guy had no choice but to return home. The mentor looked the young man sternly in the eyes and said that he wanted to tell him that people were not having such a sweet time at the present time. Liu Qingfeng asked the boy if he would save the lame Wang if he saw him in danger, but Yu Sheng didn't know that. The young man said that he saw with his own eyes how the rescued man pointed a knife blade at his savior, and also saw how 3 lives were given for 1 piece of bread. The teacher stood up and said that he probably shouldn't have forced the boy, since the world had never been on his side. He walked up to Shen, put his hand on his shoulder, and asked himself why he had decided to force the boy to protect the world in the first place. But suddenly, the teacher noticed something that made him swallow nervously and remove his hand from the boy's shoulder. In one of his hands, the boy held tightly a small blade, which he had recently used to cut the mad awakened one into pieces. The man took 1 step to the right and suggested talking about something else. He asked Yu Sheng if he had any friends, and he told him about a girl who remained in the criminal city but was supposed to leave after 307 days. The teacher lit a cigarette and asked the boy what he would do if someone tried to catch his girlfriend. The young man looked coldly at his mentor and said briefly that he would kill anyone who dared to do this. But Liu Qingfeng did not stop and asked that even if it was the whole world, the guy's thought remained unchanged, as he was ready to kill the whole world. The man looked at the lame van and added that he was the same, only he protected this world. Yushin didn't know this, so he looked in surprise at the poor guy sadly serving desserts to the cafe's guests. Liu Qingfeng threw away his cigarette butt and told the boy to follow him, because the teacher wanted to show him something. After a 15-minute walk, they found themselves at a veterans camp where several dozen crippled souls watched over the guests. Suddenly, a man approached them and asked the teacher who he had brought this time, and Liu introduced his student in a calm voice. The husband approached the guy, looked at him carefully, and scratching his beard added that the guy looked good. But in an instant, Yu Shen saw a strange magazine peeking out from behind the stranger's jacket. At that very moment, Shen leaned over sharply and reminded the man of Moja's criminal code, according to which the public sale of magazines like his was punishable by 15 days arrest or a fine of 2,000. The stranger looked at the young man in bewilderment, and he, in turn, showed him 3 fingers, adding that this was exactly the amount that would be enough. The husband took Yu Sheng by the shoulder and led her in the opposite direction from the teacher, saying that he only wanted to talk about something with the baby. He indignantly stated that 30,000 would cost him his life, to which the guy replied that he meant 300. The irritated camp worker cursed the boy and said that he had only bought a few magazines to earn a little money to live on. Yu Sheng had no intention of backing down, so he cleared his throat and added that such magazines were sold in the north of Mobei at Brown's music store. He said that magazines were sold at that place for 1 yuan, so the man should still have 800 left. The man shouted loudly that 200 was the maximum he could offer. Otherwise, Shen could leave and disgrace him in front of the teacher. But the guy said indifferently that if he reported his husband to the ministry, he could get 5,000, after which he began dialing the required phone number. The stranger immediately snatched the phone from his hands and declared that it was his earnings for the funeral, since he did have a conscience after all. But since the man did not hang up, someone's voice was heard on the phone asking his name. Zhong Yushu immediately declared that it was a big mistake and immediately hung up in panic. He gave the young man 300 and said that he wouldn't even haggle, because the guy didn't take money seriously at all. The man began to mutter discontentedly that he was a hero, guarding and calming demons for 30 years, spilling blood. Liu Qingfeng, in turn, watched his old friend and boyfriend with a smile and was glad that Zhong Yushu liked the guy so much. Finally, they began to return to the teacher, and Zhong Yushu himself continuously praised the guy, saying that he had an excellent upbringing. The mentor was comically embarrassed and thanked for the kind words, adding that he would continue to try. After thinking for a moment, Yu Shen, who was standing next to him, said that the man could change the format of his business a little, replacing the prohibited discs with regular ones, and then he wouldn't have to worry. At that moment, the thought flashed through Zhong Yushui's mind that the guy really did know a little about business. He asked him curiously if he had been awakened, to which Yu Sheng replied that the assessment was supposed to be this week. With a wide smile, the man asked the boy in admiration how many patterns he had, but the boy ignored him. He laughed and said that such caution was unnecessary since he needed to learn to trust those around him. The teacher brought the boy to the veterans to show him. So within a few minutes, they were standing in front of the graves of old Zhang's wife, son, and parents. The mentor said that he left the last empty grave for himself because the man himself lived so long that he witnessed 2 changes of management of the Ministry of the Unclean. He said that people could indeed live differently, but despite this, the human race always needed those who could protect it. Liu Qingfeng gently placed his palm on the young man's head and said that he hoped to see the boy as a protector. Remembering what had happened the last time, the man looked carefully at the boy's hands. But this time, he did not see any weapons there. The teacher said that outside the criminal city there was a vast world that Yu Shun simply had to see. But suddenly behind them they heard Zhang's enraged shout, ordering them to move away from his family crypt since it was not a zoo. Liu Chenfeng was a little embarrassed, realizing that the man was indeed right, and Shen, as always, remained indifferent. An unknown man in a black robe sat at a small table and quietly spoke on the phone to the divine slave that the plan needed to be accelerated. He said that the last operation was too big, as even the Ministry of Exorcism had to join in the purge, causing them to suffer huge losses. The man suddenly exploded, exclaiming that it was impossible to start the plan during the assessment, since Zhang Bei was the one who was guarded the most. Yu Shen stood in the middle of the school principal's huge office again, about to say something to him, but a strange scroll appeared in his head again, making him think about his magic item, a stick that doubled his strength and speed, and increased his combat effectiveness tenfold. Forcing a smile, the director asked the boy if he had any guarantees that his results would be promoted to the top 10, but the boy had no idea. According to the rules of the crime city, one could never be sure if all the information was not known, since the task could be failed. The director said that previously the limit was 100 points, and for every promotion a guy got up the list, he was going to give him something. He thought for a few seconds and, slamming his fist on the table, added that he would give the guy 100, and if he reached first place, he would receive 10,000. Hearing such conditions, Yu Sheng turned around and headed towards the door, saying goodbye to the director. The husband immediately exploded at the guy and blocked his exit, saying that if their school rises to 3rd place in the regional ranking, they will receive a tidy sum, which they can divide between themselves 70-30. The guy looked up at the director and praised his plan, but in the end asked if the man would like to earn more. He came back and walked back to the principal's desk and then began to outline a plan involving the school uniform, which required the involvement of 3 students. The guy advised the director to send his consent to the management and then put an advertisement on the school uniform. He handed him a business Bible and added that the students would become walking billboards because they would get good seats and give interviews in that school uniform. Finally, the guy said that this is how they will achieve fame, and the children will be more than happy to spend money on a school uniform. Hearing such a wonderful plan, the director was delighted and said that the boy could well trust him because the head of the Mobei Education Department was his old friend. After such a violent reaction, Yu Sheng suddenly asked the man if he was a reserve officer, to which he was surprised and replied that he was. The guy looked at him anyway and didn't answer, thinking that in that case the man shouldn't be trusted. He decided to ask how exactly the director was going to divide the money he received, and he answered with a smile that Shun would get 60%, which, in his opinion, was quite generous. The young man turned his head the other way and looked out the window with an empty gaze, expressing his own dissatisfaction. In desperation, the man shouted that he would give the guy 70%, and that was the limit, because the school's reputation and his connections also cost money. Yu Sheng looked at the director again, nodded his head, and agreed to the deal. Hearing the agreement, the director ran to the table, saying that he would put a seal on the contract so that the agreement would be officially signed. The guy took his mobile out of his pocket and said that he had recorded the entire conversation on a dictaphone, so a contract was not needed. After that, without any hesitation, he left the office, loudly slamming the door behind him and leaving the director looking after him in confusion. The man, in turn, was seething inside, since all he wanted was money. And now he also had to think about whether the boy would report him to the ministry. Exactly 1 week later, Yu Sheng stood in the same place, carefully examining the jacket, on the back of which advertisements were visible. In the gymnasium where the exam was about to begin, Zhao Zi stood and begged Yu Sheng not to beat him, while Yu Sheng stood silently opposite him. The boy's eyes were filled with tears, his nose was bleeding, and his face was covered in bruises, while the boy asked Shen to at least do it more slowly. Before Zhao could finish speaking, Yu Sheng suddenly swung his arm and was already casually preparing to strike. The poor guy prepared himself for the worst, gritting his teeth and closing his eyes tightly, but a split second later, all he heard was a loud bang, and its echo throughout his body as the boy aimed at the punching bag that Zhao was clutching tightly. The guy screamed and flew to the ground along with the punching bag, losing his balance. However, he did not let go of the pair and, pouring out, added in a whisper that, although his friend was kind, his blow was incredibly strong. Keishu stood and watched the boys, thinking that he also needed to improve his fighting ability, since that was the reason he transferred to the new school. However, seeing how a moment later Sheng grabbed his friend's leg and began to throw him from side to side as he screamed in pain, Du Shu's thought changed slightly. The guy's moment of patience ran out, and for the sake of an experiment, he decided to join the fight. However, a few minutes later, Du Shu was lying on the floor next to poor Zhao in the same state as him. In order to get some fresh air, Yushin, in turn, went out into the corridor and under the first wall of the gym, thoughtfully staring at the floor, while the teacher slowly approached him. Seeing the boy flying in the sky, Liu Qingfeng walked over and asked him what he was thinking. The young man looked up and asked what would happen if he had to fight during the exam, since he didn't want to and had no intention of doing so. The mentor suggested that he shoot past or make the blades of the daggers duller, but the guy didn't like this idea since he wasn't going to deliberately ruin the weapon either. Shen looked at the floor again and asked Liu Qingfeng why it was forbidden to kill people outside the crime city. Hearing such a question from his student, he laughed and put his hand on his shoulder. After that, he gently stroked his head and asked if the guy remembered the veteran from the cafe. The mentor said that tomorrow he was going to go to veterans camp, since his only son had also joined the reserves. He added that recently Moj had been constantly pushing him. And because the teacher had no children, he also had to go to the veterans camp. But after a short pause, he added that since Shen was his student, it was considered a child, and the teacher wanted to use this privilege to avoid going to the camp and stay with him. The guy agreed, because the teacher really became quite close to him, despite the fact that he hadn't liked him very much before. The mentor looked at his student with a gentle gaze, and for a moment tears appeared in his eyes, which he immediately pushed away. They walked through the city towards the city gates of Mobei, and finally, after several dozen minutes of walking, they reached their destination. As he crossed the road, Liu Qingfeng advised the boy to think about it, since he had almost no problems with his character. Shen walked over to a table where a man with a badge around his neck sat writing down the name, age, ID number, and parents' name of everyone who wanted to join. The boy gave his name and age, after which the man asked him if Liu Qingfeng, who was standing next to him, was his father, to which he replied that his father had not come. The teacher then took matters into his own hands and confidently asked the man to put his name down on the guardian's list, as he was the young man's teacher. Suddenly, their attention was drawn to a loud explosion that sounded several blocks from the city gates. The people standing around screamed in fear, starting to panic and assumed that the explosion had occurred near the school. The man with the badge shouted loudly that the heretics had decided to break into human life again, and Moja had already sent people to deal with them, so the people needed to calm down. Liu Qingfeng turned to Shen and, calling him the first in the province, added that he was waiting for him. The teacher opened a portal through which he himself passed, and after him, Yu Shen headed there, waving goodbye to the man with the badge. Not even a minute had passed when people, having just heard about the heretics, immediately began to scream terribly and run away in all directions. Suddenly, a man with a badge appeared in front of Liu Qingfeng, sternly saying that the city was dangerous, and therefore they were not allowed there. The teacher, in turn, menacingly declared that he was a reserve officer and guarded the Pledge of Humility for 2 unclean years, so protecting people was his calling. Suddenly, a fairly large group of men gathered around him, who had also once served as pawns for demons and were ready to protect the human race. They gathered together into one large battalion, and, shouting that protecting people was their main task, moved to help. The man with the badge shouted after them that it would be difficult to get through the city, so he would stay there and hope for their victory. At that time, the thought was stuck in his head that in the past, during demon attacks, people stood until the end. But this time, humanity was weakened, and the end could be very unpredictable. At that time, a bunch of strange strangers in robes, obviously heretics, flew into the school. Wang Wen, standing in the middle of a crowd of children ready to fight, reported that the heretics had indeed decided to attack the school. One of the students, who looked older than the others, said menacingly that they had to act quickly. The other one, holding a red lollipop, suggested fighting to the death as it would be faster. While Wang Wen was taking out a large axe from behind his back, the heretics finally came close to the school and began shouting out their prayers to the servants of God. The captain loudly declared that since Moj was not there, he was leading the troops that had to finish the battle within 5 minutes, and anyone who disobeyed the order would feel their head fly off their shoulders. After such a loud statement, behind his back he heard dissatisfied words about how, having just joined the reserves, the guy could not give such impudent orders. The bus driver returned and saw Liu Qingfeng's figure behind him, who had come to help. The man who arrived with him laughed and said that he remembered Wang Wen because he had been beaten daily in the army as a child, and he had cried loudly in response. Taking advantage of the moment when the bus driver was distracted, the man tripped him and he fell to the floor, after which the stranger laughed and reminded him that it was impossible to be distracted during a fight. Liu Qingfeng loudly gave the order to block the gates and not allow any more casualties as he brought people to protect the school. Not a moment passed before a terrible battle broke out between the defenders and the heretics. Zhong, who had escaped for the first time in a long time to go fishing, enjoyed the sight of the float in the water, gently rocked by the waves. Suddenly he heard heavy steps behind him and immediately realized that his pleasure would end there. Behind him, the assistant to the head of the ministry, Moj, appeared, confidently walking towards him. Dissatisfied, Jun returned indignantly and asked what had happened because the man had scared him. The husband reported that Lin Feng of the 4th generation begged him to return from seclusion. Deep down, Zhong let out a sigh of relief because he thought that My Day had returned again, so he scolded the stranger and ordered him to leave because he had no intention of coming back. He returned to the fisherman again and added in conclusion that if he returned to the pledge with the level of strength he had now, he would simply be blown away by the wind. The man again began to beg him to come back, since the 3rd generation was barely holding the front, and without Zhong, the outpost of unclean humility would not be able to stand. But the fisherman continued to refuse. Suddenly, a representative from the ministry pulled out a strange little box from his pocket. He opened it and handed it to Zhong, again asking him to come back because he believed that what was in the box would convince him beyond words. The fisherman smiled and asked if his body would really become the same as it once was if he ate the pearl that was in the box. The stranger said that Mobe had been attacked, and there was chaos in the city itself, and therefore, without the man's help, they would all witness the death of people. Zhong turned his gaze towards him again with displeasure and reproached him for threatening him with the lives of innocent people. The poor man was already willing to accept any terms, since he was simply fighting for Moby and had nothing else to offer. Finally, after such a lot of persuasion, the fisherman stood up and, sighing, took the magic pearl in his hands. Suddenly, a question came from behind him asking if the man was really willing to become a human support again, and behind him he saw 3 men in long black robes who joyfully congratulated the esteemed Zhong. The ministry envoy turned towards them with displeasure and asked if they really were missing the other 2. Their leader paid no attention to this and said that if Zhong ate this medicine, then in 3 days the demons would again begin a large-scale battle for the pledge of the unclean one's humility. But this did not frighten him, and in response the heretic only grinned. Reaching for the magic pearl, an unknown magical force suddenly appeared around the men, swirling around them all, especially the pearls that Zhong was holding in his hands. Without hesitating for long, the man threw the magic medicine into his mouth and swallowed it, deciding on such a desperate step. Suddenly, a strange purple glow began to flicker around his body. His eyes began to glow with blue flames, and a huge spear began to appear behind his back. One of the heretics cried out in fear, realizing that this was the 8th Bodhi, which was the highest spiritual enlightenment. Finally, having completely transformed, Zhong loudly declared that the heretics had gone to great lengths to hide their spy in Moga. Suddenly, fear appeared in the eyes of one of them, since the man had no way of knowing about it. But the master, in turn, confidently declared that the heretic had lived his life long enough to finally say goodbye to him. The magic spear that was behind his back suddenly began to spin around, leaving behind a blue trail. After circling the air a few times, he pierced all 3 heretics through and through, flying past them with lightning speed. One of the heretics, who had held out the longest, asked the master to answer one of his questions before he died, but the man refused, arguing that he did not have time. Zhong ordered the representative who stood behind him in confusion to call Chen Yimo and order him to get the nets. The man didn't immediately understand what the master meant, so he had to repeat it twice, but this time in a more irritated voice. The messenger dialed the commander's number and informed him that Mr. Zhang had ordered the nets to be pulled out. Noticing the man's trembling voice, the master muttered with displeasure that only idiots were coming out of the Lin Nian Academy these days. However, immediately after this, he ordered the messenger to follow him, since it was time to dot the I's and cross the T's. Hearing the sounds of fuss, veterans from the camp appeared out of nowhere behind the envoy, looked sadly after the master, and asked if he really would not return. Without stopping, the man menacingly replied that if his old bones could still help humanity, then it was worth it. Yu Shen, in turn, walked peacefully through the forest, holding a crossbow in his hand, because it was in that forest that the exam was to be held. Suddenly, he came across two huge creatures very similar to demonic werewolves. An idea appeared in his head that due to the high level of defense of the monsters, it was impossible to kill them with a regular crossbow arrow. But suddenly, the guy's hands shimmered with a purple glow and they appeared somewhat, to which the guy looked in surprise and did not understand whether he was awakening. But in the blink of an eye, one of the monsters heard strange sounds of magic, after which his eyes immediately glowed with blue flames. The huge demon immediately rushed at the young man, growling loudly and releasing his huge claws. He flew towards the guy, while in Yu Sheng's hands, a magical thing similar to a bat was still forming, with everything around it glowing with purple light. Deciding not to wait for the magic to finish its work, the guy quickly pulled out a dagger and at the last second thrust it into the strong body of the demon that had attacked him. Blood immediately fell on the ground, and the guy in turn was proud of his attack, which was quite good. Sensing danger, a bunch of other similar demons began to emerge from the forest, which were already a little more like real wolves. However, this did not frighten the guy at all, and a second later, he was rushing from one wolf to another, cutting their throats. Within a few minutes, the lawn where Yu Sheng had been shot by the demons was completely littered with the bloody bodies of the impure. But suddenly, on the tree that was right above the guy's head, he noticed a rather strange bird that screamed loudly. A moment later, a huge group of the same birds flew over him, which obviously did not have very good intentions. The creatures pounced on the young man, trying to attack him, but a counterattack in their direction was not long in coming. The stranger, standing on one of the branches of the tallest tree in that forest, looked at the lawn in surprise and was amazed at how the animal spirits had died in just 15 minutes. He looked closely at the map in his hands and saw a large red mark in the middle of the forest. The man was genuinely surprised that someone was already almost at the finish line, but he immediately thought that it could be that same Yu Shen that everyone was talking about. The man looked into the distance tensely, wondering if the trouble had really finally left Zhongbei after so many years. Yu Shen, meanwhile, was flying between the trees at full speed, trying to reach his destination as quickly as possible. He kept saying about himself that he needed to hurry to get out and see as soon as possible. But out of nowhere, a huge tiger appeared in front of the young man, forcing him to stop. The guy looked at the creature with irritation, mentally cursing it and feeling a little disappointed. The next second, he unfolded his own jacket and pulled out a bunch of large but very sharp needles and threw them at the creature. But the sticks only bounced off the tough skin hidden under the tiger's soft fur, thereby angering the demon. However, Shen did not lose his head, and from somewhere he took out a very strange thread, which he wound around 2 fingers and looked menacingly towards the evil spirits. Suddenly, an arrow flew out from behind the guy's back, which he barely managed to dodge. The arrow hit the tiger's neck and slightly grazed it, but for such a huge animal, it was a drop in the ocean. Taking the strange thread in both hands, the guy jumped up, preparing to pounce on the tiger, which was already flying in his direction. The guy tied a thread around the beast's neck so that it didn't even see it. Leaving the tiger no choice, Yu Sheng landed on the ground, pulling the 2 ends of the rope together, which eventually crushed the beast's neck. The helpless demon fell to the ground with his tongue hanging out, after which he remained lying at the guy's feet. Shen looked at his work with satisfaction and was glad that it was over, as he could finally walk through the portal and join everyone else. The boy was serious, and therefore knew that when he went out, he would meet Teacher Liu, alive or dead. The mentor, desperately competing with the heretics, suddenly saw a portal behind him, from which a male figure was slowly emerging. He was seriously surprised that the guy managed to get out after only 20 minutes. The boy looked at the teacher and with a hint of curiosity asked him what position he had received. The teacher proudly declared that he was the first in the entire province, or at least the first in Mobei. Hearing this, the guy turned around and headed towards the city, which the mentor didn't like very much. Lu Qingfeng blocked his way and said that the city was incredibly dangerous and the guy was injured and he needed to deal with that first. Instantly, the boy pointed his crossbow at the teacher and coldly threatened him with a blow if he tried to stop him again. But this did not stop the mentor, and he shouted furiously that in that case the young man would have to kill him, because he would not allow him to enter the city. Yusheng did not immediately put away his weapon, because he was convinced in his heart that the mentor must be afraid of death, or this was all fake and he was just acting out a scene. But the boy still put away the crossbow and said that he was responsible for his own life, after which he walked around the teacher and ordered him not to interfere, or he would really have to kill him. At that time, a real battle was raging in the city between the heretics and the brave defenders of Mobi, who desperately resisted the evil spirits. One of the most skilled was that same student who looked beyond her age as she put the pagans one after another into eternal sleep. From time to time, a very strange object made of diamond alloy, incredibly rare in those parts, would appear in her hands. However, with his help, the girl dealt even faster with a bunch of heretics who tried to defeat her in cold blood. The other black shirts, who stood and watched as their colleagues got their asses kicked, hardly dared to join the fight. The defenders, one after another, slit their throats and pierced their bodies with sharp swords, fighting for their own will. A sweet girl, who initially never let go of a lollipop, killed men in cold blood with a smile on her face, not caring at all about what people thought of her. The bus driver, in turn, shouted loud slogans in support of the soldiers and encouraged them to fight, because they had to stand firm. Suddenly, a huge spear appeared in his hands, shimmering with a golden glow, and the man rushed at full speed towards the flock of heretics. This spear was almost the last thing one of the black shirts would have seen, but he managed to dodge it at the last second. In that same second, a huge axe appeared in Wang Wen's hands, which he swung at the bastard again. But he, surprisingly, turned out to be more agile, and therefore dodged his attack and knocked the man himself to the ground. The poor captain flew to the ground, but a second later, a young lady appeared above the heretic who had done this to him, in whose hands a large dagger was flaunting. The girl thrust the blade into his back with all her might, shouting threats loudly, after which he even screamed in pain. The bus driver looked at the rescuer with displeasure, as he was ashamed of allowing the girl to save him. But new heretics kept appearing, creating the appearance that there were so many of them that it would be impossible for the defenders to stop them. At school, meanwhile, another group of them was also shouting loudly, shouting threatening slogans at people. Liu Qingfeng and the principal stood menacingly at the school's threshold, realizing that they had not been stopped at the gate. The teacher loudly declared that they needed to hold out until reinforcements arrived, taking up his massive sword and preparing for battle. Within a second, the black-shirted warriors were all flying above the man, trying to escape from his ill-fated sword. Liu Qingfeng fought fearlessly against evil spirits, defending his honor and protecting the entire human race. The poor schoolchildren watched this scene from the window, scared to death. Noticing this, the director shouted loudly to them that the children had the opportunity to see what would happen to those who attacked his people. A huge red dagger instantly appeared behind the man's back, and the director himself said that at his age, he too had undergone a pledge of obedience to the unclean. The husband grabbed hold of his hand tightly and attacked the heretics, not sparing any of them. Together with Liu Qingfeng, they took turns cutting down the pagans, remembering their own youth and rejoicing that their victory was just around the corner. Suddenly, the director heard some strange sounds that attracted his attention and made him return. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a strange man with wings appeared before them, laughing at their words about cleansing the world of evil. The school principal squeaked and called their sect vile monsters who didn't care about people. The eccentric, who looked like a cook, in turn declared that people would be able to live in unity with the gods only after the shedding of light on the earth. The teacher, hearing his speech, said menacingly that since the eccentric did not consider it necessary to protect people, it was time for them to begin the battle. The man looked at him with a glassy gaze and laughed, adding that he liked his mentor's straightforwardness. Suddenly, he spread his scarlet wings and flew with all his might towards the warriors. He charged at Liu Qingfeng and knocked the sword called the Devil's Graveyard out of his hands, which was quite symbolic. Looking at the feeble teacher, the feathered one angrily declared that he really felt sorry, since the sword would start killing peaceful people for the first time in its history that day. However, fortunately, the mentor managed to break free from the thief's strong embrace and retreat a few steps away from him, turning his sword around. Mad laughed loudly and said that God's light would finally shine upon this world, since humans were nothing more than dirt on its surface. He flew into the air and loudly proclaimed an appeal to the respected gods, calling on them to give God's light to humanity. Suddenly, the teacher saw that it began to fly away and immediately realized that the bird's target was the students who were in the school. He quickly decided that he would take care of the problem himself. Since protecting his charges was the duty of every teacher in the world, Liu Qingfeng instantly rushed towards the school, while simultaneously watching the weirdo flying towards the school above his head. Suddenly, he jumped back to the ground and, gathering all his strength and swinging, ordered the eccentric not to even come close to his students. Not expecting such a turn of events, the bird immediately flew to the ground, unable to react in any way to such a blow. The force with which the teacher hit the pagan was so great that his body broke through the asphalt. However, without dragging the cat by the tail, the man quickly stood up, saying that all the teacher had managed to do was make him even more angry. Without waiting for long, Liu Qingfeng called the man a scoundrel and attacked him again with his sword, not even giving him time to call out. But this time, the bird was a little more attentive and at the last second managed to cover his face with his wings, which stopped the teacher's blow. Liu Qingfeng looked at this scene in shock, not understanding how this happened since no one had ever been able to resist his sword before. The cook turned his crazy gaze on the man and loudly said that after death he would acquire a divine image, after which feathers immediately began to fly out of his wings. The teacher did not expect this at all, so he simply did not know how to react to the feathers that were flying towards him at a furious speed. Although they were small, they flew through Liu Qingfeng's body, leaving behind a bunch of deep cuts from which blood immediately gushed out. The cook finally got rid of his wings, while the teacher landed on the ground, exhausted, still trying to stay on his feet. But the man was truly mad, so he just laughed loudly, causing the feathers to swirl around him. The next second, accelerating the small red feathers to the speed of light, he again directed this huge beam at the man. But knowing how he could resist such a power this time, after waiting for a second, Liu Qingfeng loudly shouted the command to begin. The man swung his sword with all his might, heroically trying to reflect the red beam of magic. In the blink of an eye, the same beam of magical power appeared in front of his face, but it was purple, moving towards the red one. Gritting his teeth in pain, the man gathered himself together and directed all his strength at the bastard. The purple beam hit the fat man right in the heart, causing him to lose his balance and fall to the ground. Confusion and anxiety were evident on his face, as the man did not understand how the teacher could have done it this time. With a huge sword thrust into his chest, the chef found himself kneeling in front of Liu Qingfeng. The teacher, in turn, holding a pile of wounds from which blood was pouring, menacingly said that he would immediately punish anyone who dared to attack his people. Convinced that he had completely defeated the enemy, the poor fellow fell to the ground, barely holding on to his own sword. He barely kept his eyes open when he suddenly saw Yu Shun's silhouette slowly approaching in front of him. At first, the teacher thought he was dreaming, since hallucinations were inevitable when death was imminent, but his student really did appear in front of him, which made the mentor incredibly happy. Yu Sheng bowed to the teacher and told him that he had won first place in Mobei. However, he still did not know about the province. While the teacher said that the guy had always been the best in his eyes, Shen looked at his teacher with an incredibly confused look, realizing that he was slowly dying. But Liu Qingfeng tried to perceive death as something that could free one from all earthly sins. He took a small blue badge from his pocket and gave it to the boy, saying that it was his little pride, with which the young man could feel that he belonged to the hero's family. The guy took the gift in his hands, and the mentor said that all this time he was trying to protect him, even though he was from a criminal city. Liu Qingfeng extended his hand to the boy, trying to grab his head. However, realizing this, the young man himself leaned towards him. His mentor ordered him to never let anyone change who he was, because the boy was truly special. Suddenly, the teacher saw a very bright, snow-white light before his eyes, as if beckoning him. It was the first time Yu Shun had looked at someone with such confused, fearful eyes and didn't understand how he could help his teacher. The sword teacher suddenly glowed with a bright white light, and a bunch of small butterflies appeared around him, flying up into the sky. The first tear in the young man's life immediately rolled down his cheek, which caused something in him to change. The guy stood up and screamed furiously that everyone around him would die because his eyes were burning with rage and his hands were filled with determination. He grabbed his dagger and immediately rushed at the heretics with the desire to kill each of them. The guy rushed from one person to another, cutting each of their throats and throwing out all his rage. He thrust the knives harshly into the necks of each of them, and in his eyes there was nothing but unbearable pain. Other defenders immediately began running up to the young man to stop his rage, but the boy did not pay any attention to this. The bus driver screamed, not understanding what had happened to Yu Sheng, since no one had ever killed enemies or even demons so cruelly. Zhong, who had just arrived at the school, looked at what was happening in the schoolyard in shock. The schoolyard was completely strewn with a pile of dead bodies of black-shirted people, and in another corner, Liu Qingfeng was sitting motionless. There were a lot of bloody wounds on his body, and several bright white butterflies were still flying around the man himself. Finally realizing what had happened, Zhong slammed his spear on the ground in anger, saying that he would definitely avenge his friend. He instantly thrust the spear into the asphalt with such force that another purple stream of magic emerged from it. The man twirled his weapon, throwing away all the blacklighters who were around, feeling pain in his heart for his dead friend. Suddenly, behind the trees, he saw a huge silhouette and two red eyes, after which he said that he did not expect at all that the old liar would decide to appear. A moment later, a huge snake, whose claws were the size of half a car, jumped out from behind the trees into the schoolyard. Finally, Wang Wen realized that the heretics' main plan was to destroy all the main force and then invite their king. Smiling evilly, Zhong said that the 6-star Demon King had decided to give him a gift in honor of his return to office. But upon hearing these words, the creature only hissed angrily that the fact that the husband had once killed the king did not mean his victory over the snake. But Zhao did not agree with this and threatened the demon with cruel retribution. Without hesitating for long, the man jumped up and, pointing the spear straight at the snake's throat, flew at it. But the creature managed to close its mouth in time, and therefore the blow fell on the snake's thick skin. His eyes filled with blood and flared with anger, which was clearly not good. The snake abruptly threw its head so that it managed to throw Zhong away from itself. But the man did not lose his head and managed to take control of the situation in time. He landed softly, breaking with his own feet so hard that smoke came out of them. The snake dropped to the ground and looked Zhong straight in the eyes with an enraged expression, preparing to attack. The husband grabbed his spear tightly and confidently shouted that very soon the snake would join his former king underground. Gathering all his strength, the master rushed at the demon as quickly as he could, and this time the snake tried to distract himself to prevent the blow, but it did not help him much since the man had calculated such a step. Zhong swung his sword and threw it straight at the place where the snake's skin was the thinnest. The snake squealed in pain and fell to the ground with its entire vast soul. Zhong looked at him menacingly and shouted loudly that in order not to shame the hero's spirit, all that was needed was to destroy absolutely all of them.